Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I don't know how to start this. I keep thinking that if I don't write it down, maybe I can pretend it didn't happen. But I can't stop seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that moment again, over and over, like my brain won't let me forget. I work late most nights. It is not by choice, but the hours pay better, and I don't mind the quiet drive home. The streets are usually empty by the time I leave. Just a few headlights in the distance, the occasional car parked on the side of the road. I never really thought about it before. That night, I was even later than usual. I had stayed behind to finish up reports, and by the time I stepped outside, the parking lot was nearly deserted. Just my car and two others, both closer to the building. The street lights in the lot buzzed, casting that yellowish light that makes everything look a little off. I remember the way my footsteps echoed on the pavement as I walked to my car. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob and heard the familiar click. Everything felt normal. I got in, threw my bag onto the passenger seat, and shut the door. The moment the lock clicked into place, I let out a breath, the kind you don't realize you're holding until it's gone. I was exhausted. My shoulders ached, my eyes burned. I just wanted to get home, shower, and sleep. I turned on the engine, and the dashboard lights flickered on, casting that dim glow over the inside of the car. My hands were on the wheel, but I didn't move right away. I reached up to adjust the rearview mirror, and I saw him. Someone was sitting in my back seat. I don't know how to describe what that moment felt like. My brain couldn't catch up to what my eyes were seeing. There was just a shape, a dark figure sitting in the middle of the back seat, hunched forward slightly. Not moving. Not speaking. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I felt frozen. My fingers clenched the wheel so tight they ached. The hairs on my arms stood up, my skin crawling with something worse than fear. It was the kind of feeling that doesn't just scare you, it changes you. The figure was completely still. No sound, no shifting. Just sitting there. Watching. I forced myself to move, even though my body felt like lead. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. I didn't dare look back again. I didn't want to see more. I yanked the handle. Nothing happened. The door was locked. I hit the unlock button, but the moment I did, I heard the sound of fabric shifting. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement from the back seat. He was moving. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slammed my palm onto the horn, a long, sharp blast that shattered the silence of the parking lot. My other hand fumbled for the door handle again, yanking at it desperately. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then I heard another sound. The door behind me, the back seat door, opening. I turned my head just enough to see movement in my peripheral vision, a shape slipping out of the car, quick and deliberate. The door shut with a soft click. And then, nothing. I didn't wait. I threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking lot so fast my tires screeched. My breath was coming in short, panic gasps, my whole body shaking. I didn't look back. I couldn't. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized my phone was still in my bag, untouched. I could have called someone. I could have taken a picture, done something. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting away. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at my reflection in the windshield. My face was pale, my eyes wide and unfocused. I checked the back seat again. Empty. The next morning, I called my boss and told him I needed the day off. I didn't explain why. I just couldn't go back to work that night. I couldn't go back to that parking lot. I don't know how he got in. I don't know how long he was there. And the worst part? He never said a word. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it'll help me stop thinking about it. Maybe I just need to see it all laid out, like proof that it really happened. I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been able to sleep since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm being watched. Like I'll open them and see something that shouldn't be there. It was supposed to be a weekend away. Nothing fancy, just a short trip to get out of the city. Me and Lauren had been together for almost 3 years, and we both needed a break. She found this place online, a small cabin a couple of hours from home, tucked away in the woods, just far enough to feel like we were really getting away from everything. It looked nice in the photos. Cozy. Clean. Private. The reviews were good, too. People talked about how peaceful it was, how they barely saw another person the whole time they were there. That sounded perfect. We got there just before sunset. The drive had been long, and I was tired, but the place looked exactly like the pictures. A little one-bedroom cabin with a small porch, surrounded by trees. The host had sent us a key code for the door, so we let ourselves in. It was nice inside. Warm, with wood-paneled walls and a big bed in the center of the main room. There was a tiny kitchen off to the side, and a bathroom down a short hallway. It smelled like pine and something else, something faintly chemical, like a cleaner that hadn't fully faded yet. Lauren dropped our bags near the bed and stretched, sighing like she could finally relax. "This is perfect," she said, smiling at me. I smiled back. It did feel nice. Quiet. Safe. I didn't notice the blinking light at first. We spent the first hour just settling in, unpacking a little, making coffee. Lauren wanted to watch a movie, so she grabbed her laptop while I wandered around, looking at the little details of the place. There were a few framed photos on the walls, generic landscape shots, the kind you'd see in a waiting room. Nothing personal, nothing that gave any hint about the person who owned the place. Then, while I was standing near the bed, I looked up. There was a smoke detector on the ceiling, positioned almost directly above the bed. Nothing strange about that. But there was a tiny red light on it, blinking slowly. I don't know why it caught my attention. Smoke detectors have lights, right? But something about this one made me uneasy. The blink was too slow, too deliberate. It didn't seem random. I felt something in my stomach tighten. I grabbed a chair and dragged it under the detector. Lauren looked up from her laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I climbed onto the chair and reached up, squinting at the device. Up close, I could see that the plastic casing wasn't fitted together properly, like it had been taken apart and put back together again. My fingers brushed over it, feeling for a latch or a screw. The plastic cover popped off easily. Inside, there was a small black lens. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. A camera. A tiny, hidden camera, pointing straight down at our bed. My breath caught in my throat. Lauren must have seen my face change, because she set her laptop aside and stood up. What? She asked, stepping closer. What is it? I didn't answer. I just held the plastic cover out to her and pointed at the lens. Her face went pale. For a few seconds, we didn't say anything. I could hear the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the faint rustling of the trees outside. Then Lauren exhaled sharply. Is that a camera? I nodded. My hands felt clammy. She looked around, her breathing picking up. There could be more, she said. Her voice was shaking now. Oh my God, what if there are more? That snapped me out of my daze. I jumped down from the chair and grabbed my phone, opening the flashlight app. I started checking everything, the vents, the light fixtures, the picture frames. Lauren did the same, pulling open drawers, looking under furniture. We found 2 more. One was in the bathroom vent. The other was hidden inside a bedside lamp, the hole so small you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Lauren was on the verge of tears. We have to get out of here, she said. Right now. I agreed. I grabbed our bags while she fumbled with her phone, trying to call the police. No signal. I checked mine. Nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi. Lauren cursed under her breath. We have to leave, she said again, voice frantic now. What if he's watching us right now? That thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed the car keys, and we practically ran out the door. The sun had just set, and the trees cast long, twisting shadows over the dirt driveway. I clicked the car remote. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. The car was dead. Panic started rising in my chest. I turned to Lauren. We need to go on foot. Her eyes were wide. It's miles back to the main road. I don't care, I said. We can't stay here. We started walking, fast. The woods around us were eerily quiet. No wind, no animals. Just the crunch of our footsteps on gravel. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone stepping out of the cabin, following us. Then, maybe 15 minutes down the road, I heard it. A car engine. I turned my head so fast my neck cracked. Headlights, bright and blinding, coming up the road behind us. Lauren grabbed my arm. What do we do? My heart was hammering. The car was getting closer. Too fast. We hide, I whispered. We scrambled into the trees, ducking low behind some bushes. The car slowed as it reached the spot where we had been walking. A black sedan. Tinted windows. It stopped. For what felt like forever, nothing happened. The engine idled, the headlights shining down the road. I could hear Lauren's breath, shaky and uneven. My own pulse was roaring in my ears. Then the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. I couldn't see his face, just his silhouette against the headlights. He stood there for a moment, then took a slow step toward the trees. Toward us. I held my breath. My muscles ached from staying still, but I didn't move. Didn't blink. The man took another step, then stopped. He was looking right at us. I thought we were caught. Then, out of nowhere, another pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Another car, coming down the road from the opposite direction. The man hesitated, then turned back to his car. He got in, and a second later, the black sedan sped off, disappearing into the night. Lauren and I didn't move for a long time. When we finally did, we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, where a gas station was still open. The attendant gave us weird looks as we breathlessly asked to use their phone. The police took nearly an hour to arrive. By the time they reached the cabin, it was empty. No sign of the cameras. No sign of a man. Just our abandoned car, sitting there with the battery mysteriously drained. They never found out who did it. The listing was taken down the next day. The host never responded to messages. It was like the whole place just disappeared. But someone had been watching us. And whoever they were, they knew we were there. I got home late that night. I was exhausted, barely paying attention as I pulled into the driveway. The street was quiet, just the way it always was. A couple of porch lights were on in the distance, but no movement, no sounds except the wind pushing against the trees. It had rained earlier, and the pavement was still wet, reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, rubbing my eyes. My head ached from staring at a screen all day, my shoulders tight from being hunched over my desk. I just wanted to go inside, take a shower, and sleep. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and got out, stepping over a small puddle in the driveway. As I walked up to the door, something tugged at the back of my mind. I didn't remember locking the door that morning. It wasn't something I usually forgot. I had a habit: lock the door, double check it, pull the handle to be sure. But as I reached for the knob, I hesitated. Maybe I had been in a rush. Maybe I just wasn't thinking straight this morning. I pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. The door was locked now. I slid my key in and turned it, the deadbolt clicking open. When I stepped inside, the house was silent. Dark, except for the glow of the kitchen light I had left on. The air was still, the way it always was when no one had been home for hours. I kicked off my shoes and set my bag down by the door. Then I froze. There were muddy footprints on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. They started just past the entryway, trailing across the hardwood. Dark, what marks that hadn't dried yet. Someone had been inside. My first thought was that I had tracked them in myself. Maybe I had stepped in mud without realizing it. But then I saw the size. Too big. Too wide. Not mine. A cold feeling crawled up my back. I forced myself to move, stepping carefully around the prints. They led toward the hallway. Toward my bedroom. I swallowed hard and reached into my bag for my phone. My fingers felt clumsy, shaky. I should have called someone right then. The police, a neighbor, anyone. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe it yet. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find if I admitted this was really happening. I took another step forward. The footprints weren't just messy, there was a pattern to them. The person had walked in, paused near the living room, then moved straight down the hall. No hesitation. Like they knew where they were going. Like they had been here before. I reached the edge of the hallway and stopped. My bedroom door was open. I always closed it when I left. Always. The footprints led inside. The air in the hallway felt heavy, thick. My own breath sounded too loud. I took one slow step forward. Then another. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open all the way. The room looked normal at first. My bed, my dresser, everything where it should be. But the closet door was open. Just a sliver, just enough to see darkness beyond it. I stared at it, my pulse hammering. Someone could be in there. Standing just behind that door, holding their breath, listening. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles ached. I should have run. Should have backed out of that room and left the house. But I didn't. I took one more step. Then I heard it. A breath. Not mine. It was soft, barely there, but I heard it. A quiet inhale, like someone trying to stay silent. The room spun for a second. I moved before I could think. I turned and bolted down the hallway, nearly slipping on the floor. My feet hit the entryway hard, and I fumbled with the lock, my hand shaking too much to work the deadbolt. Behind me, the bedroom door slammed. I didn't look back. I got the door open and stumbled onto the porch, sucking in the cold night air. My legs felt weak, my hands numb. I ran to my car. I got in, slammed the locks down, and grabbed my phone. My fingers felt useless, barely able to hit the right numbers. The call connected. I told the operator there was someone in my house. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. They told me to stay on the line, to stay in my car. I kept my eyes on the house. The front door was still open, swinging slightly in the wind. A few minutes later, red and blue lights washed over the street. The police searched the house. There was no one there. The footprints were still on the floor. The closet door was wide open, but whoever had been there was gone. They didn't take anything. Nothing was out of place. The only thing they left behind were the footprints. And the closet. Open. Waiting. I was driving home late that night, later than usual. The highway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, the lines on the road glowing under my headlights. I had been on the road for hours, and my eyes felt heavy, the kind of exhaustion that made everything seem slower. There was no one else around. Just trees on either side, nothing but blackness beyond them. The occasional road sign flashed past, but I barely registered them. I just wanted to get home. That was when I saw the red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. A cop. My stomach tightened as I glanced at my speedometer. I wasn't speeding. Not even close. I had my seatbelt on. My registration was up to date. There was no reason for me to be getting pulled over. But the lights kept flashing, and the car stayed behind me. I sighed and put on my turn signal, pulling onto the shoulder. The gravel crunched under my tires as I slowed to a stop. I put the car in park, exhaled, and waited. In the mirror, I saw the officer step out of his car. He moved slowly, like he was in no rush. His patrol car didn't look out of place, just a standard black and white. The kind you see everywhere. But something about it felt off. I couldn't place why. I kept my hands on the wheel, fingers tight around it. The officer approached my window, flashlight in hand. The glare hit my face, making me squint. He was wearing a uniform, dark blue, but the patch on his sleeve didn't look right. I couldn't read it in the light, but I knew it wasn't the usual state trooper emblem. I had seen those before. Something was wrong. I rolled my window down halfway. Not all the way. "Evening," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. He didn't sound bored or tired, the way cops usually do on late shifts. He sounded careful. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked. "You were swerving a little back there," he said. "Were you coming from?" I hadn't been swerving. Not even a little. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just heading home," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about something. License and registration? I hesitated. Just for a second. He noticed. Something felt wrong. The longer I looked at him, the more certain I was. His uniform was just a little loose, like it wasn't quite his size. His badge was there, but the name on it was too small to read. And the patch, the one that should have had the state insignia, wasn't right. It looked close, almost convincing, but it wasn't. I didn't move. "Sir," he said, "I need to see your license and registration." I swallowed hard. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face blank. "Can I see your badge?" I asked. He didn't react right away. Just stood there. Then he smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Step out of the car," he said. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put. "Why?" My voice stayed even, but my hands were sweating. "Step out of the car," he said again. "I won't ask again. Real cops don't talk like that. Not right away. Not without explaining why." I glanced in my side mirror. His car had no department markings. No unit number. No decals. Just a black and white with lights on top. This wasn't a cop. I felt it in my gut. I forced myself to look at him again. My pulse was racing, but I tried to stay still. "I'll call in and confirm first," I said, reaching slowly for my phone. The second my hand moved, he reached for his hip. Gone. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot onto the gas. The tires spun on the gravel before catching the pavement. The car lurched forward, my breath locked in my throat. In the mirror, I saw him move fast, running back toward his car. The red and blue lights flashed behind me as he jumped in. Then his headlights blazed on, and he followed. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My whole body was tense, my heart slamming against my ribs. The speedometer climbed past 70. He was gaining. The highway stretched ahead, empty. No exits, no other cars. Just dark road and trees. I had no idea where the next town was, how far I was from the nearest gas station or rest stop. I grabbed my phone with one hand, my fingers fumbling over the screen. 911. It rang. The dispatcher picked up. 911, what's your emergency? A man pretending to be a cop pulled me over. "He's chasing me," I said, my voice shaking. "He's not real. His uniform's wrong. He's in an unmarked car. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm. "Where are you?" I had no idea. My mind blanked. I looked at the signs flying past, trying to catch one. Highway 36, somewhere south of. Headlights flashed in my mirror. He was right behind me. Then he swerved. His car veered into the other lane, pulling up beside mine. I turned my head. He was looking right at me. Then he jerked his wheel. He was trying to run me off the road. I swerved hard, barely keeping control. My tires hit the rumble strip, the car shaking beneath me. I yanked it back just in time. "He's trying to crash into me," I shouted into the phone. "Send someone, please." "Stay on the road," the dispatcher said. "Units are on the way." My whole body was locked up, hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. My foot pressed the pedal to the floor. I didn't know how fast I was going anymore. The fake cop's car swerved again, jerking toward me. A sign ahead. Rest stop. 2 miles. I didn't slow down. If I stopped on the side of the road, he would catch me. I had to get somewhere with people. The lights of the rest stop appeared in the distance, faint at first, then brighter. Please let someone be there. Please. I didn't slow down until I hit the exit. My tires screeched as I took the turn too fast, my car bouncing slightly as I pulled into the lot. A semi-truck. A couple of parked cars. And 2 state trooper vehicles. Real ones. I slammed the brakes and threw the car into park. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I turned. The fake cop's car was stopped at the exit, just beyond the rest stop entrance. For a second, I thought he was going to follow. Then he turned off his lights. And he drove away. The troopers saw me. They came over fast, asking what happened, if I was okay. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. My whole body was shaking. They sent cars after him. Took my statement. Asked me 100 questions. They never found him. He was gone. I don't drive at night anymore. I liked running at night. People always told me it was dangerous, but I never worried too much. I stayed on well-lit paths, never wore headphones, and always kept my phone in my pocket. Besides, I had been doing it for years and never had a problem. That night was cold, colder than I expected. My breath came out in sharp, white puffs as I moved. The streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement, and the trees lining the path were still, barely moving in the wind. I took my usual route, looping around the neighborhood and cutting through the park. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everything seem bigger. Even the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud. Then I saw them. A jogger. A little ahead of me, maybe 50 feet or so. I couldn't make out details, just a shape in dark clothing. Their pace was steady, moving in the same direction as me. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual to see other people out, though it wasn't exactly common either. I kept going, my shoes tapping against the pavement. I adjusted my speed slightly, moving a little faster. So did they. I slowed down, just a little. They did too. I frowned. It was strange, but I told myself I was imagining it. Coincidences happened. I kept going. A couple more minutes passed, and I tried again. I picked up my pace, stretching my legs a little farther. They did the same. I slowed down to a jog. They matched me. My mouth went dry. I wasn't imagining it. The space between us stayed exactly the same, no matter what I did. It wasn't like they were unaware of me and just running at their own speed. This was deliberate. I glanced around. The park was empty. The only sounds were my own breath, my footsteps, and theirs. I had 2 choices, stop or turn around. I didn't want to stop. If they were doing this on purpose, stopping might give them the chance to get closer. I didn't want to turn around either. But I had to do something. I veered left at the next path, taking a different route than usual. It led toward a small parking lot near the park entrance. From there, I could cross the street and head toward houses, toward lights, toward people. They followed. My stomach clenched. I wasn't just being paranoid. They had changed direction because I had. They were watching me. I ran faster. So did they. The parking lot was just ahead. A single street lamp flickered over it, casting long, broken shadows. There was a car parked near the entrance, but I didn't see anyone inside. I didn't stop running. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with one hand, fingers shaking. I didn't even know what I was going to do, call someone, pretend to be talking to someone, something. Anything. I reached the lot and crossed toward the sidewalk. The street was just beyond it, a row of houses on the other side. Then I glanced back. They had stopped. Right at the edge of the path. Just standing there. I felt my pulse in my throat. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them under the flickering streetlight. But they weren't moving. I kept walking, my breaths coming fast. I didn't want to run outright, not yet. I didn't want to look like I was panicking, even though I was. I reached the sidewalk. My legs felt weak, like they weren't working right. I kept my phone in my hand, trying to decide if I should call someone. Then I made the mistake of looking back again. They were gone. Just gone. I scanned the path, the trees, the empty parking lot. Nothing. I felt sick. I didn't wait any longer. I ran. I crossed the street fast, barely looking for cars. I didn't stop until I was halfway up the block, where the houses had driveways with porch lights on. I forced myself to slow down, breathing hard, my throat burning. I told myself I was safe now, but I didn't feel safe. I looked around again, scanning every shadow, every parked car. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it, like I was still being watched. I had lived in that building for 5 years. It was an old place, creaky floors, weird pipes, but the rent was decent, and the landlord, Joe, was all right. He was one of those guys who tried to do everything himself instead of hiring professionals, which meant things got fixed eventually, just not well. That day, he knocked on my door and asked if I could give him a hand with a leak in the basement. The guy was in his 60s, and I felt bad saying no, so I followed him down. The basement was always cold, always smelled like damp wood and dust. The light was yellow and weak, casting long shadows. The pipes overhead dripped sometimes, but this was different. There was a puddle spreading across the concrete floor near the back wall. Joe muttered about the old pipes as he knelt down, twisting a wrench against the rusted metal. I stood behind him, holding the flashlight. Then I saw the door. It was on the far wall, past a shelf stacked with old paint cans and boxes. I had been down in that basement plenty of times, doing laundry, helping Joe out. I had never seen that door before. It wasn't like the others in the building, those were painted white, some with peeling edges. This one was brown, almost black, with a metal handle that looked newer than everything else down there. No dust on it, no cobwebs. I pointed at it. Did you put in a new storage room or something? Joe stopped working and turned his head. When he saw what I was looking at, his whole body stiffened. That wasn't there before, he said. I let out a short laugh, expecting him to joke, but he didn't. He just stared at it. I walked toward it. The air felt colder the closer I got. Joe stood up behind me, wiping his hands on his jeans. He came over, hesitated, then grabbed the handle. The door wasn't locked. It swung open without a sound. The smell hit first. Not the musty basement smell. This was different. Warmer. Like food. Inside was a small room. Carpeted. A bed, neatly made. A table with 2 chairs. A lamp on a wooden dresser. A plate sat on the table. A sandwich, half eaten. Next to it, a bottle of water, still covered in condensation. A blanket on the bed, slightly rumpled. Someone had been here. Recently. My stomach clenched. Joe stepped in, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I was looking at the walls. There were no windows, no vents. Just that door. Joe reached for the plate, touched the sandwich. His fingers came away with crumbs. "This is fresh," he said. His voice was shaky. I turned, looking back at the door, then at the floor. There were no footprints in the dust outside the room. No sign of anyone coming in or out. But someone had been in here. Joe checked under the bed, inside the dresser. Nothing. The closet was empty except for a clean jacket on a hanger. The room looked lived in, but not abandoned. Like whoever stayed here had just stepped out for a moment. Then I noticed the chair. It was pulled out slightly, facing the door. Like someone had been sitting there, watching. Waiting. A sound echoed through the basement. Both of us froze. Footsteps. Not from inside the room. From upstairs. The building had 3 floors. My apartment was on the 2nd, Joe's was on the 3rd. No one else lived here. He didn't rent out the other units anymore. There should not have been footsteps. Joe moved first, stepping out of the room fast. He looked up the basement stairs, his breath heavy. Another step. Slow. Deliberate. I turned off the flashlight. The basement light above us flickered. Joe grabbed my arm and whispered, "Stay behind me." We moved toward the stairs. The steps above creaked again. Then silence. Joe reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He held it up, his hand shaking. No signal. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry. The building door was always locked. No one should have been inside. Joe reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up. I stayed back, listening, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing. Then, after what felt like forever, another sound. A door closing. Upstairs. Not slamming. Not hurried. Just closing. Joe moved fast. He took the steps 2 at a time. I followed, heart pounding. We reached the main floor. The hallway was empty, the front door locked, deadbolt still in place. Joe's apartment door was open. I had a bad feeling. A terrible, sick feeling. Joe went inside first. His living room looked normal. Kitchen, too. But his bedroom door, it was open. Just slightly. Like someone had been in there and left in a hurry. Joe pushed it open with one hand. His closet door was wide open. Inside, on the floor, a blanket. The same kind that had been in the basement room. Neatly folded. We left. Joe didn't say anything as he locked his apartment. He didn't look at me as we walked out of the building and into the cold night air. He took out his phone, got a signal, and called the police. They came, searched the place. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No prints that shouldn't have been there. No sign that anyone had been in the basement at all. But that room, it was real. Joe changed the locks the next day. I helped. Neither of us talked about the door in the basement. 2 weeks later, Joe put the building up for sale. I moved out before it sold. I never went back. I was home alone that night. I remember because it had been raining off and on all day, and I had decided to stay in, heat up leftovers, and watch something to fall asleep to. It was just past 9 when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up from the couch, hesitated, then walked to the door. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I checked the peephole. A man stood on the porch. Tall, maybe in his 40s. He wore a dark blue jacket, the kind utility workers wear, and held a flashlight in one hand. His other hand rested against the door frame. He knocked again, harder this time. I stayed quiet. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm with the power company. We've got a serious issue in the area. I need to come in and check your breaker." His voice was deep, firm. Not rushed, but like he was trying to sound in control. I frowned. The lights were on. The TV was still playing. Nothing flickered. I didn't say anything yet. Just kept watching him. He shifted his weight. Knocked again. "Ma'am, I don't have a lot of time. There's a safety risk. I just need to check something inside." I took a slow breath. Something felt off. He wasn't wearing a badge. No name tag. The jacket looked right, but there was nothing identifying the company. I kept the chain on and cracked the door an inch. "Can I see some ID?" I asked. His expression changed fast. His mouth tightened. "Look, I don't have time for this. I need to come inside." His foot moved closer. I felt my stomach drop. "Which company are you with?" I asked. His eyes narrowed. He looked irritated now. "The power company," he said. "No name. Just that." I swallowed. "The lights are fine. What's the emergency?" He exhaled sharply, like he was losing patience. "There's a major voltage problem in the area. If I don't check your system, your house could be at risk. Open the door." The way he said it, short, forceful, it wasn't right. I started shutting the door. His hand shot out, slamming against it. I gasped and pushed back. "Ma'am," he snapped, "I need you to let me in. Right now." I shoved the door harder. He pushed back. The chain held, but just barely. I could see his face better now. His eyes weren't calm anymore. They were sharp, dark, locked onto me. His jaw was clenched tight. My chest pounded. I forced my voice to stay steady. "I'm calling the power company to confirm," I said. "You don't have time for that," he hissed. His fingers curled against the door frame. "If you don't let me in, this whole place could go up in flames." I moved fast. I pushed the door with everything I had and threw the deadbolt. He hit it with his fist. I jumped back. My hands were shaking. His voice was right against the door now. "You don't understand what you're doing," he growled. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling to dial 911. Another hit. Harder. I ran to the kitchen, my breath coming in quick gasps. The operator answered. I whispered, "Someone's trying to break into my house." Before I could say more, the banging stopped. Silence. I stayed crouched behind the counter, gripping the phone. The dispatcher was talking, but I barely heard. My ears were ringing. I forced myself to move, staying low, peeking around the corner. The porch was empty. I didn't hear footsteps. No car pulling away. Nothing. I told the dispatcher everything, gave my address. They sent a car. The officer checked outside, then inside. Nothing was broken. No sign of forced entry. Just a few scuff marks on the door where he had pushed. They asked if I had cameras. I didn't. I tried to describe the man. Average height, dark jacket, flashlight. Nothing else stood out. They told me to keep the doors locked and call if he came back. That was it. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made my skin crawl. The next day, I called the actual power company. They had no workers in the area. No emergencies. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he was out there before he knocked. I just know I never saw his car. And I never heard him leave. It was late, and I was on my way home from visiting my sister. She lived out in the countryside, and I always hated the drive back. Long stretches of nothing, barely any streetlights, just empty road and thick trees on both sides. It felt like being in the middle of nowhere, and if something happened, there wouldn't be anyone around to help. I wasn't even halfway home when I heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The hum of my tires on the road, the steady sound of the engine. I had music playing low, but under it, I thought I heard something else. Faint. Muffled. A cry. I turned the music down and slowed a little. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. I rolled my window down just a crack. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sound with it. A baby. I looked around. There was nothing but trees and road. I checked my mirrors. No cars behind me. No houses nearby. No reason for a baby to be out here. The crying was coming from the woods. My hands tightened on the wheel. I kept driving. It didn't sit right with me. What if someone had abandoned a baby? What if someone needed help? I eased off the gas. My headlights cut through the darkness, landing on a narrow dirt path to my right. The crying sounded like it was coming from somewhere down that path. I pulled over. The second I did, I felt it. A deep, twisting feeling in my stomach. The kind of feeling that tells you something isn't right. I kept my doors locked, one hand hovering near my phone. I listened. The crying didn't stop. It didn't get weaker or stronger. It stayed the same. The same pattern, the same pauses between wails, like it was looping. I sat there, gripping the wheel, heart pounding. And then I remembered. There had been a story. A warning. Something I had read online or maybe seen on the news. A woman had gone missing after stopping on a road just like this. They found her car, the driver's side door open, keys still in the ignition. No sign of her. The only thing people reported hearing that night was a baby crying in the woods. I turned my music back up. I put my foot on the gas. As I pulled away, something moved in my rearview mirror. A shadow. Not a baby. Not an animal. A person. They had been standing just inside the tree line, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop again. I drove straight home, locked every door, and sat in the dark, trying to calm down. The next morning, I reported it. I gave them the location, told them what I heard. The officer on the phone was quiet for a moment before saying, "You did the right thing by not stopping." They sent a patrol car to check. They didn't find a baby. They didn't find anything. But they did find shoe prints. Deep ones, like someone had been standing still for a long time. Right at the edge of the trees. I first met him when I was taking groceries out of my car. He was standing on the sidewalk, holding a box, looking like he was about to introduce himself. He had a nice enough face, maybe late 40s, dressed casually. A little too friendly, but I didn't think much of it at the time. "Hi there," he said, shifting the box to one arm so he could wave. "Just moved in next door." I nodded and gave him a small smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thanks. It's nice to meet you. I'm Gary." He glanced at my grocery bags. "Need a hand?" I shook my head. "I've got it, but thanks." He smiled wider, like he expected me to say more. I didn't, just unlocked my door and started grabbing the rest of my bags. "Do you live alone?" he asked. That made me pause. I turned slightly, trying to keep my face neutral. "Why?" He chuckled. "Oh, just making conversation. I work from home, so I like to know my neighbors. Keeps things from getting too quiet." I forced a polite laugh and nodded. "Yeah, it's a nice area." I went inside and locked the door. It wasn't the last time we talked. He always seemed to be outside when I left for work or when I came home. If I was heading to my car, he'd call out a greeting, ask how my day was. It felt normal enough, except for the way his questions got more specific. "Got a long shift today? You work late often? Ever switch up your schedule?" I started giving vague answers, but he didn't stop asking. It wasn't enough to set off alarms, but it was enough to put me on edge. One morning, I saw him talking to the mail carrier. I stepped out just in time to hear him say my name. He cut himself off when he saw me and gave a little wave. The mail carrier walked away. I stood there for a second, then went back inside without saying anything. That night, I got home earlier than usual. My boss had let me leave early, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening. When I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept over something near my back door. Someone was crouched there. For half a second, I didn't believe what I was seeing. My brain didn't catch up right away. But then he turned his head, and I saw his face. Gary. My stomach dropped. His hands were on the lock, something thin and metal between his fingers. He wasn't struggling with it. He looked calm, focused. Like he had done it before. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed. Then he saw me. For a split second, he didn't react. Then he stood up fast, slipping the lockpick into his pocket like nothing had happened. He smiled. "Hey there," he said, like we'd run into each other at the grocery store. I didn't answer. I didn't even get out of the car. He took a step toward me. "You're home early." I locked my doors. His smile twitched just for a second. He glanced at the door. Thought I saw something weird. Wanted to check it out for you. I still didn't move. His fingers tapped against his leg. "You okay?" I forced myself to nod. He watched me for a second longer, then shrugged. "All right. Well, have a good night." Then he walked away. Just like that. I sat there until he was inside his house. Until his lights turned on. My hands were shaking. I don't remember getting out of the car, but I must have, because suddenly I was inside, locking every door, every window. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called a locksmith. I had every lock changed. When Gary saw them working, he came outside with a coffee cup in hand. "Something wrong?" he asked. I didn't answer. He just stood there, watching. A week later, he was gone. His house was empty. No moving truck, no goodbye. Just gone. I never found out where he went. I didn't want to. It started a few weeks ago. Just a little noise at night, barely noticeable at first. It sounded like something scratching, small and faint. I figured it was a rat or some other animal trying to get into the walls. I've heard stories about things like that, so I didn't think much of it. But after a few days, it started to get louder. At night, when everything else was quiet, the scratching would start again. It was coming from the air vents. I live in an old building, so I just assumed it was a mouse or something stuck in the ducts. I didn't think it was anything to worry about. I figured I'd deal with it later, maybe get someone to check the vents. But the sound started getting worse, more frequent, and sometimes even late into the night. I couldn't sleep well with it, and after a few days, it started driving me a little crazy. One night, I finally decided to check. I don't know why I didn't do it earlier. Maybe I was hoping it was just a one-off thing, but after hearing it again, I grabbed a flashlight and started looking around the vents. The noise had stopped by then, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started with the main vent in the living room, where the noise had been the loudest. I shone the light into the grill, but I couldn't see anything. It was too deep, too dark. I had no idea how far the ducts went, but it didn't matter. I could feel my heart start to race. What if something was in there, trapped? I didn't want to be one of those people who let a small problem go on too long, so I figured I would just set up a camera for the night, see if I could catch whatever was making the noise. I put the camera on a shelf in the living room, pointed at the vent, then went to bed. I didn't expect much. I thought I'd just find out if there was a rat or something, but I didn't expect to get footage that would make my stomach twist. The next morning, I went straight to the camera. I was half expecting to see nothing, just silence, but I needed to check. I fast-forwarded through the footage until the noise started. And there it was. The scratching. The same sound, only this time, I could hear it clearly on the camera, even though I hadn't been able to hear it in real time. It was louder now, as though something was trying to push its way through. I leaned in closer to the screen, frowning. The camera was focused on the vent, but the scratching continued for several minutes. Then, something strange happened. A hand reached out of the vent. It wasn't like a normal hand either. It was thin, almost skeletal, with long, spindly fingers. It came out slowly, and I could see the pale skin stretch as the fingers curled around the edge of the vent. The hand didn't seem to have any weight to it, no noise. It was just there. My body went cold, and I had to rewind it twice. I didn't want to believe it, but it was there. A hand. Reaching out. I froze, staring at the screen. I had no idea what to do. It didn't make sense. I thought it was a rat, or some sort of animal, but this was no animal. It didn't look right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe I was seeing things. But no. The hand was too distinct, too clear. It wasn't a mistake. The footage didn't stop there. The hand stayed in the vent for a while. And then, after a long pause, it started to pull itself back in. The fingers curled inwards, and the hand disappeared into the vent like it was nothing more than part of the wall. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, but there was one thought that wouldn't leave me. Someone was in my house. I didn't know who. I didn't know how. But there was no other explanation. Someone had been in my walls, and they had been watching me. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them everything, about the scratching, about the hand. I'm sure I sounded crazy, but they said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't feel much better, though. I didn't feel safe. I didn't leave the apartment. I couldn't. I sat in my living room, my eyes constantly scanning the fence, the walls, the shadows. I kept checking the footage over and over again, hoping to see something that would explain it away, but there was nothing. When the police arrived, they checked the fence and the rest of the apartment. They didn't find anything, no signs of forced entry, no marks on the walls, no sign that anyone had been inside. They told me I could have been hearing things, maybe it was the building settling, or even animals, but they didn't have an answer for the footage. One of the officers even joked that it looked like something from a horror movie, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They left, telling me to keep the doors locked and maybe get someone to inspect the building. I didn't feel relieved. I spent the next few days checking every vent, every corner, but nothing changed. The scratching stopped for a while, but I didn't trust it. The thought of someone or something moving through my walls kept me up at night. Eventually, I moved out. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, listening to me. Even now, months later, I still hear scratching sounds in my head. I never found out what it was, or who it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never living in an old building again. Not ever. And I still wonder, if I had stayed just one more night, would I have seen more than just a hand? We decided to take a road trip to clear our heads. It was the sort of spontaneous thing you do when you're all in your 20s, just looking for an adventure. We packed up the car, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road. The plan was simple: drive south, see where the road took us, maybe camp out somewhere if we felt like it. The whole trip was meant to be carefree, nothing serious. But things got weird. After driving for hours, we stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places that felt like it was stuck in time, like the whole town didn't realize the world had moved on. The gas station was old, the lights flickering a little, but it was fine. It was just a place to fuel up, stretch our legs, and get back on the road. We parked the car, and the rest of us were standing outside, talking about how we were all starting to get hungry. My friend Sarah, who had been complaining about needing to use the bathroom for the past hour, decided to go inside. "All right, I'll be quick." "Don't leave without me," she said, grabbing her phone. We all waved her off, and she went into the gas station. We hung around outside, chatting, joking, passing the time. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed Sarah still hadn't come out. I checked my watch. It had been almost 15 minutes. That didn't seem right. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason for her to be in there for that long. At first, I thought maybe she was just taking a little longer, but then I started feeling uneasy. It was just strange. I looked over at the door to the gas station. The fluorescent light inside flickered, and I could see people moving around inside, but Sarah wasn't one of them. The clerk was there behind the counter, and there was some guy standing by the candy aisle, but no Sarah. I turned to the others, feeling a bit tense. Has anyone seen Sarah come out? They all shrugged. She's probably still in there, one of them said. But even they were starting to look around, as if they were getting an odd feeling too. I told them I was going in to check. I walked toward the door, the little bell above it ringing as I pulled it open. The cold air inside hit me immediately. It felt strange, like the air was heavier, but I couldn't explain it. I looked around, scanning the aisles for Sarah, but she wasn't there. I walked to the counter where the clerk stood. He was an older guy, probably in his late 40s. His eyes were tired, and he looked like he'd been standing there for hours without much to do. I cleared my throat. Hey, have you seen a girl come in here? Tall, blonde, kind of wearing a hoodie? The clerk glanced up, blinking slowly, like he hadn't expected me to ask that. No one came in here, he said. I stared at him, unsure if I had heard him right. What do you mean, no one came in here? She went inside like 15 minutes ago. He didn't look up at me, but he kind of shrugged, still sorting through something on the counter. I don't know what to tell you. No one came in here. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I looked around again, then back at the clerk. Are you sure? She went to the bathroom. She has to be here. He just shrugged again, like he couldn't care less. I'm telling you, no one came in. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what he was saying. I thought maybe he was messing with me, but there was something about his voice, something flat in his tone, that made it sound too serious to be a joke. I turned and walked to the back of the store, checking every aisle. No Sarah. I went to the bathroom, knocked on the door, but there was no answer. It was just so quiet. No one else had gone back there since I came in. I walked back to the counter, feeling a bit panicked now. Are you sure no one came in here? There's no way she would have left without me seeing her. The clerk just nodded slowly. Yep. No one came in. Not her, not anybody. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned back to the door, still hoping to see Sarah coming out, but nothing. The other guy in the store had walked out while I wasn't looking. The place felt empty, almost too quiet. I turned to the clerk again. Look, can you check the bathroom or something? Please. He looked up from his work. She's not in there. I already checked. I felt my pulse racing now. I couldn't explain it. It was like the whole place had become unsettling, like something wasn't right. I walked out of the store and back to the car, trying to hide the panic that was starting to creep in. The others were standing outside, waiting for me. I looked at them, my eyes wide, my breath shallow. She's not in there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The clerk says she never came in. They all stared at me, confused. What do you mean, never came in? One of them asked. We saw her go in. I nodded. I know. I saw her too. But the guy inside said she didn't. There was silence for a moment, and then one of them laughed nervously. Are you sure you're not just freaking out? Maybe you missed her. I shook my head. No, I'm not crazy. There's something weird going on. We all went back inside together. I was hoping that maybe we'd find Sarah just hanging out in one of the aisles, laughing at us for being paranoid, but that wasn't what happened. The store was empty. The clerk was still standing behind the counter, and now he looked even more uninterested, like he wasn't paying attention to us at all. We walked through the aisles again, calling out for Sarah. Nothing. Not a sound. The store felt even quieter now, like we were the only ones left in the world. I don't know what to think. We left the gas station and started driving again, but Sarah was still gone. We haven't heard from her since that night. I don't know where she went or why she didn't come back out. I still can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that place. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me or if something really strange happened. But I know one thing for sure, I'm never stopping at that gas station again. I've always been cautious when it comes to applying for jobs online. But after months of looking with no luck, I got desperate. I had been working part-time at a cafe for the last year, and I knew it was time to find something more stable. When I saw the ad for a marketing assistant position, I thought it was too good to pass up. The pay was decent, the description sounded like exactly what I was looking for, and the company seemed reputable enough. The job posting didn't have much detail about the company itself, but it had a solid-looking website, so I figured it was fine. The email came through a couple of days later, inviting me to an in-person interview at their office building. The address was in the downtown area, so I knew I could find it easily. They didn't give any specific instructions about where to park or enter the building, but I didn't think much of it. It was an interview, not a big deal. I arrived at the building around 10 a.m. on the day of the interview. The building looked normal from the outside, but as soon as I walked through the main doors, I felt a strange vibe. The lobby was almost too quiet, and the lights were dimmer than I expected. There was no receptionist at the front desk, just an empty, polished counter. The whole place felt sterile, like a waiting room that was never used. I checked the address again to make sure I was in the right place. The number matched up, so I walked toward the elevators. I hit the button, and after a moment, the elevator doors slid open. I pressed the button for the floor listed in the email, the 11th floor, and the elevator began to ascend. When the doors opened, I was surprised at how empty the floor looked. The hall stretched out in front of me, with only a few doors lining the walls. Most of the doors were shut, and the few that were open revealed empty office spaces with no furniture, just bare walls. It felt wrong. A stark, empty hallway in a supposedly busy office building. I kept walking, looking for the interview room. Eventually, I found the office door with a small plaque reading Marketing Department. I knocked once, and when there was no answer, I pushed the door open. Inside, I found a man sitting at a desk, his back to me. He turned around when I entered, stood up, and smiled. "You must be Emily. Welcome. Come on in." His voice was smooth, but there was something about it that seemed off. It didn't quite match the situation, the emptiness of the office, or his slightly too wide smile. His shirt was neatly pressed, but I couldn't help but notice the lack of a tie. I forced a smile, trying to keep my nerves in check. "Thank you," I said, stepping into the room. I couldn't help but notice how minimalistic it all was. The desk was large but empty, nothing on it except a single laptop and a few pens. There were no papers, no files, no signs of work being done. The walls were bare, the window shades drawn. It felt like an office that had been abandoned or was just setting up, but it wasn't. The man gestured to a chair in front of the desk. "Please, have a seat. Let's get started." I sat down, still trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He pulled his chair closer to the desk and sat down, facing me. He introduced himself as Richard, the head of marketing for the company, though he didn't mention the company's name, something that didn't register until later. He started asking me basic interview questions. My background, my previous work experience, why I was looking for a job. I answered all the questions the best I could, but the whole time I couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't really listening. His eyes were fixed on me, but not in a way that felt natural. It was almost like he was sizing me up, studying me. After about 10 minutes, the interview took an odd turn. He asked me to tell him about my current job and what kind of schedule I had. I told him that I worked part-time at a cafe and mentioned that my hours were flexible, and I was looking for something more stable. He nodded slowly and asked, "Are you comfortable working alone for long hours? Do you mind the idea of being by yourself in a quiet office?" I was taken aback by the question. "I don't mind it, as long as there's work to do. I'm fine with being alone sometimes." He gave a slight nod, his smile still there, but it seemed to be fading. "Good. It's just that this position requires a lot of autonomy, and sometimes you might find yourself alone in the office for hours. Does that sound okay to you?" I hesitated. I didn't know if he meant the entire office would be empty or if he was just asking about the occasional quiet moment. I said, "Sure, that sounds fine. I'm used to working independently." He leaned forward, his smile gone now, replaced with a serious look. "Perfect. So, you'll be comfortable working with no distractions, won't you? No one else around?" I felt uncomfortable. There was a slight shift in the air, like something had changed. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, and the silence between us grew. "I guess," I said, unsure how to respond. I tried to focus on his questions, but the longer he spoke, the stranger everything felt. It was as if I had walked into a place where I wasn't supposed to be. He didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. I shifted in my seat. I had the distinct feeling that I had overstayed my welcome, but I didn't want to leave too early. Maybe it was just nerves, but everything about this place was starting to creep me out. Finally, he spoke again. "Thank you for coming in, Emily. We'll be in touch soon. I think you'd be a good fit here." I didn't know what to say. It was as if the whole interview had turned into an evaluation of something else, something I wasn't quite sure of. I stood up, trying not to show how unsettled I was. "I appreciate your time," I said, walking to the door. He followed me, and when I reached for the handle, he stopped me. "Just one more thing," he said. "Don't worry about the office being empty. You'll get used to the silence. It can be peaceful, you know?" I didn't respond. I just left, feeling the door close behind me with a soft click. I walked out of the building, trying not to look back. My gut told me that something wasn't right. There was no other employees, no company logo anywhere, no indication that this was a real business. I pulled out my phone and checked the email again. The company name wasn't listed anywhere. I never heard back from him. I didn't want to. That was the last time I ever applied for a job from an online listing without doing a lot more digging first. It's been a few weeks now, and I still feel unsettled thinking about that interview. Something about it didn't add up. It all started when I moved into my new apartment. I had just finished my first year of college and needed somewhere cheap to live. My dorm was too expensive, and I wanted to get a place off campus. After weeks of searching, I found a listing online for a small one-bedroom apartment. The photo showed a clean, cozy space with hardwood floors and a big window that looked out onto a quiet street. The rent was incredibly low for the area, which was why I jumped on it immediately. I contacted the landlord, who replied quickly and asked me to come by for a quick tour. The place seemed perfect. The owner was an older woman, probably in her 60s, and she was very friendly. She explained that the apartment had recently become available because her son had moved out. I didn't ask too many questions. She was eager to rent it out, and I was eager to move in. The paperwork was minimal, and she even helped me move in a few of my things on the day I signed the lease. I remember feeling relieved when I got the keys. It wasn't a glamorous place, but it was mine. I settled in quickly. The building was quiet, with only a few tenants on my floor. I didn't interact much with anyone at first. It was summer, and I had a lot of schoolwork to focus on. For the first week, everything seemed normal. The apartment was quiet, the neighbors kept to themselves, and I started getting into a routine. Then, one Saturday afternoon, everything changed. I had been studying at my desk when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I was a little confused. I stood up, walked to the door, and peeked through the peephole. There was a man and woman standing outside, both looking a little confused. Behind them, there were two kids playing in the yard. I opened the door slightly, just enough to talk to them. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, smiled but seemed a little unsure of himself. "Hi there, sorry to bother you. We live across the street, and we've been noticing that the house here has been rented out. We used to live here, and we're just a little confused. We never put this place up for rent." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, you used to live here?" "This house has been in our family for years," he explained. "We never rented it out. It's just been vacant for a while because we moved out a few months ago. But we didn't put any listing up." "Are you sure you have the right place?" I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I rented it from a woman, maybe in her 60s. She showed me the place and gave me the keys." The woman, who had been standing quietly by the man, now spoke up. "That's strange. We haven't rented it out to anyone. We've been away, but we always kept it in the family. This is where we lived." At this point, I felt completely thrown off. "You live here?" I asked, almost in disbelief. They were clearly not joking, and their confusion seemed genuine. They didn't seem like pranksters or people trying to scam me. "Yes," the man said, shaking his head, clearly puzzled. "This was our home. I'm not sure what's going on here. This place was never for rent." I felt my heart race. I stepped back a little, not knowing what to say. They weren't demanding anything, just asking questions, but their confusion made me question everything. "I don't know what to say," I finally managed. "I rented the apartment through an online listing. I signed a lease. I've been living here for a week." The woman seemed to get more concerned now. "Do you have any idea who the person is you rented it from?" "Her name was, well, I don't know her full name. She gave me a lease with her address on it," I said, fumbling for the papers. I walked back inside to grab the paperwork. When I showed them the lease, the man looked at it, his expression growing darker. "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't look like anything we've ever done," he said. "We didn't put this place on the market." My mind was racing. I kept trying to piece things together, but nothing made sense. I asked them if they were sure this was the right place, and they nodded. "Yes, The man said, "This is definitely our house. We had to move out a few months ago, but we've been taking care of it, keeping it in the family." "The woman you rented it from, do you remember her name?" I couldn't recall her name clearly, just that she had been friendly, helpful, and seemingly legitimate. I had no reason to doubt her. I thought about the transaction again, the way everything had been smooth, almost too smooth. After a few more minutes of back and forth, the family thanked me for my time. They were clearly disturbed, and I was too. I stood in the doorway as they walked away, my mind spinning with all kinds of thoughts. I looked back at the house, the place that had felt like mine for the past week, and wondered if I was in the right place. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the landlord to ask what was going on, but the thought made me uneasy. What if I was being scammed? What if the family was right, and I had somehow ended up in a house that wasn't actually for rent? I didn't want to call her and risk looking like an idiot. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to get nervous. I checked the papers again, looked at the photos from the listing, and compared the address. Everything matched. This was the right place. I had rented this apartment legally, hadn't I? The next few hours were filled with anxiety. I kept thinking about the family's confusion. If this had truly been their home, how had I ended up here? And who was the woman I rented from? I looked up the address online, tried to find any records of the family's ownership, but nothing turned up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I went to the window or moved around the apartment, I felt like someone was outside, staring at me, waiting for something. The next day, I decided to visit the local courthouse to see if I could find any more information about the property or the family. To my shock, I learned that the house had been in foreclosure several months prior. It had been sold to someone who had never contacted the family. The ownership records were strange, showing a few different names, and none of them matched the woman I had rented from. I packed my things that day. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Whoever I had rented from, whether she was a scam artist or something more sinister, I didn't want to take any chances. As I was leaving, I saw the family again. This time, they didn't say anything. They just stood there, watching me as I got in my car and drove away. I never went back to that apartment. I work the late shift at a local coffee shop, and by the time I lock up, it's usually just me, the hum of the refrigerator in the back, and the sound of the coffee machine powering down. I'm used to the quiet, and I like it that way. The regulars know my routine, and I've grown comfortable with it. But this night, something was off from the start. The evening had been typical at first, just the usual crowd, a few people working on their laptops, a couple of college students chatting over iced lattes, and one older man who came in for his usual black coffee. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had been making drinks and cleaning up, and the time seemed to slip by quickly. It wasn't until about 11:30 that I realized I was the last person there. I cleaned the espresso machine, wiped down the counters, and made sure the pastries were wrapped and put away. The place was almost empty, just the usual couple of people finishing up. I always made sure the place is spotless before I leave, so I started shutting off the lights in the back when I noticed that the guy who'd been sitting in the corner all evening was still there. I hadn't really paid attention to him before, but now that I was turning the lights off, I realized he hadn't moved. At first, I thought maybe he was just deep in thought, or maybe he was one of those people who didn't mind sitting in a nearly empty coffee shop long after everyone else had left. It wasn't too unusual for a customer to stay longer than I'd like. We get some regulars who treat the place like a second home, and I just try to make sure they're comfortable, even though I'm ready to go home by then. But as I moved toward the door, I caught a glimpse of him again. He wasn't on his phone or looking down at a book like before. He was just sitting there, still, in the dark corner of the shop, his face obscured by the shadows. I hesitated for a second. I should have locked the door already, but I hadn't finished my cleaning. My heart beat a little faster, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just lost in thought. I locked the front door and started to gather my things, my keys in my hand, ready to head out. I glanced back toward his seat, and I froze. He was still sitting there. But now, his eyes were on me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. He was staring at me, not with the casual glance I'd seen before, but with something that made my skin crawl. His eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They were locked on me, and I could see the faint outline of his face in the dim light. His expression was hard to read, but it was clear that he was waiting for something. I couldn't look away. For a moment, I stood there, my hand still gripping the keys. I thought about calling the police, but that seemed ridiculous. It wasn't like he'd done anything wrong. He was just sitting there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step toward the door. "Sir," I said, my voice a little louder than usual, "we're closed. You need to leave." He didn't respond. His gaze never wavered. I swallowed hard and repeated myself, a little more firmly this time. "We're closed. You need to leave." He didn't move. He didn't say anything. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. It was like he was daring me to make a move, like he wanted to see how long I would stand there, just staring at him. I took another step, my hand still on the door. The silence between us stretched, and it felt like it was getting heavier, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't name. There was no reason for this. It was just a man sitting in a coffee shop. I had dealt with far worse situations before. But this felt wrong. I forced myself to look away from him, my gaze flicking to the clock. 11:45, 15 minutes past closing. I had to go. But I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't shake the dread creeping up my spine. I glanced back at him one last time, expecting him to have stood up and left by now, but no. He was still there, his face partially obscured by the shadows, his eyes locked on me like I was the only thing in the room. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to run, but I had to check. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he didn't realize how late it was. I moved closer, cautiously. "Sir," I said, trying to sound confident. "You need to leave now." Finally, he moved. Slowly. Not enough to give me any comfort, but enough that I could see his face. There was something about it that made my blood run cold. His eyes were too wide, his skin too pale, like he hadn't slept in days. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his gaze unblinking, his face an unreadable mask. I took a step back, my hand still on the door. "I'm calling the police if you don't leave." At that, he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. "I just wanted to watch you." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Watch me. I didn't know if I should be relieved or terrified. Either way, I was done. I pushed open the door, stepped outside into the cool night air, and locked it behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him standing there, still watching. As I walked to my car, I glanced up at the window. For a brief moment, I thought I saw his face pressed against the glass, staring out at me. But then, just as quickly, the light from the street lamp flickered, and I couldn't see anything anymore. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't get his words out of my head. I just wanted to watch you. That's all he said. No explanation. No apology. The next day, when I came back to work, everything seemed normal again. The shop was busy with customers, the sun shining through the windows. But every time I glanced toward the corner where he had sat, I felt that same chill in my bones. I didn't see him again, but I couldn't forget the way he looked at me, the way he didn't move. I told my manager about it the next day, and he just shrugged it off, saying that it was probably nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every night when I close up now, I check the shop before I leave. I make sure I'm alone. I make sure the place is empty. But sometimes, just as I'm locking the door, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still there, watching from the shadows. I don't usually share stories like this, but after what happened, I can't shake the feeling that someone might understand. I hope this doesn't sound too strange, but this is what happened to me. I've been parking in the same lot every day for years now. Same spot, same routine. It's a small lot next to the office building I work in, just big enough for the employees and a few others. There's nothing special about it, just concrete, a few rows of cars, and the usual parking lines. I've parked there so many times that I could almost walk to my car with my eyes closed. I know where the piles are, which spaces are usually empty, and where the good spots are. It's like second nature. It started off like any other evening. I finished work, said goodbye to a few coworkers, and headed out to the lot. It was late, maybe around 9:30, and the lot was mostly empty, as usual. It was quiet, the air still warm with the remnants of the summer sun. My car was on the end of one of the rows, always in the same spot near the far corner. I didn't think anything of it. I just walked out to the lot, putting my keys in my hand and heading toward my usual parking space. But when I got there, something didn't feel right. My car wasn't in the spot where I remembered parking it. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure of it. I always park in the same place, 2 spaces over from the corner, in the second to last spot. It's always empty when I arrive, and it was empty when I left earlier that day. But now, my car was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had somehow forgotten where I parked it. Maybe I had parked somewhere else, maybe further down the row. But no! I looked around. There it was, parked 2 spaces over from where I had left it earlier. I know I hadn't moved it, and I know no one else would have. The lot was too quiet for anyone else to have done it without me noticing. And the spaces around it were nearly empty. I looked around, confused. Maybe I had parked further down the row, I thought again. But no, there was no way I would have done that. I was certain I parked in the same spot, the same place I had parked every day for the past 2 years. My mind started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's just a mistake, I told myself. Maybe someone else had parked in my spot and I'd just forgotten. I'd parked in a similar spot before, so it wasn't impossible. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there for a second, trying to figure out what to do. Should I walk back into the building to check if I had maybe parked somewhere else? It didn't make sense, but something about this situation felt off. My car was now 2 spaces over, but it wasn't just the position that bothered me. It was the way it had been parked. I noticed it right away, the way the headlights were positioned, how the front of my car was turned just slightly toward the curb. It was as if someone had intentionally parked it there, but I hadn't seen anyone. I walked over to the car, my heart starting to beat faster. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the unease kept growing. I opened the door, and the familiar smell of the leather interior and the slight scent of pine from the air freshener hit me. Everything was in its place, nothing seemed disturbed. The seat was exactly where I left it, my bag sitting next to the passenger seat. But as I sat down, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a faint scuff mark on the passenger side door. It wasn't huge, but it was there. And it was odd, because I was sure there had been no marks on it when I left this morning. It was small, but enough to make me pause. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. It's nothing, I thought again. But then something else occurred to me. I had locked my car when I left this morning. I always do. I have a habit of double-checking the locks before I walk away. But when I pressed the button to lock the door now, the sound was off. It didn't click the way it usually did. I tried it again. Same thing. It wasn't the same sound. It wasn't locking properly. That's when I started to feel the first real wave of panic. I opened the door again and checked the lock. It was fine on the inside. The car was fine, but the lock had a weird, almost hesitant click when I tried it again. It didn't make sense. I locked my car before I left in the morning. Why was it behaving like this now? I got out of the car and locked the door manually, trying to calm myself down. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the lock was malfunctioning or something. Maybe the scuff mark was just something I hadn't noticed before. But deep down, something was telling me that this wasn't just a simple mistake. As I stood there, staring at my car, I noticed something else, the faintest of footprints on the ground next to it. They were light, barely visible in the dim light of the parking lot, but they were there. Small, faded prints that led from the back of my car to the front, right to the spot where I'd originally parked. I felt my stomach drop. The footprints were too small to be mine, too light. And they weren't in the direction of my car, either. They were coming from the back of the lot, and they stopped right where I had parked earlier. I walked over to the footprints, not knowing what to think. They weren't clear enough to be certain, but they were definitely not my own. My heart pounded in my chest, and the back of my neck prickled with the realization that someone had been here. Someone had moved my car. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at those footprints, but after a few moments, I felt a jolt of fear rush through me. Maybe someone was watching me. Maybe someone had been inside my car, or maybe they had just been waiting for me to leave. I didn't want to be in that parking lot anymore. I didn't want to be alone in the quiet of the night with nothing but the sound of my breathing and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. I glanced around the lot, but there was no one else. Just empty spaces and the dim glow of the streetlights. I got back in my car, locked the door as best as I could, and drove off. I didn't look back. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, feeling like I was being followed. I had no reason to think someone was behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When I got home, I checked my keys to make sure they were the ones I'd left with that morning, but nothing seemed out of place. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a weird coincidence. But the whole situation kept swirling in my mind. The scuff mark, the strange way the lock clicked, and those footprints. They didn't add up. For a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in that parking lot, watching me. I don't know why I'm sharing this here. I guess it's because I still can't make sense of what happened, and maybe putting it into words will help me understand. I don't really know what happened, or why it happened, but it scared me more than anything I've ever felt before. It started on a Friday night. I'd been looking forward to this concert for weeks, and it was amazing, honestly, one of the best shows I'd been to. The energy in the crowd, the music, everything was perfect. By the time the show ended, it was nearly midnight. I was tired, but I was also buzzing from the excitement. I had planned to grab an Uber and head home, so I pulled up the app and ordered a ride. I stood outside the venue for a while, looking at my phone, checking the map to see where my ride was. The streets were pretty crowded with people leaving the concert, so I figured it might take a minute. I wasn't in a rush, just wanting to get home and relax. After a few minutes, I saw the little icon on the app showing that my Uber had arrived. I looked up and saw the car pulling up. It was a black sedan, nothing fancy, just a regular Uber. The driver waved at me from the window, and I walked over to the car. I opened the back door and climbed in. The man in the front seat gave me a friendly nod and then turned his attention back to the road. It was a pretty standard ride, I thought. He didn't say much, and I didn't feel like talking either. The streets were still crowded, but we started moving. My apartment was about 20 minutes away, so I settled into the back seat and tried to relax. I didn't feel any immediate sense of danger or unease, just the usual tiredness after a long day. About halfway through the ride, just as we passed a large intersection, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I didn't think much of it and pulled it out to check. It was an unknown number, which wasn't unusual, but it wasn't something I was expecting either. Normally, I don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but for some reason, this time I did. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello? The voice on the other end was calm, but there was something strange about it. A little too calm. Hi, is this my name? The voice asked. I paused for a second. Yes, it is. Who's this? It's your Uber driver. I'm still waiting for you at the pickup spot. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I looked up at the man driving me, who was still focused on the road, his eyes on the traffic. I was quiet for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. Was he joking? Was this some weird mistake? I tried to keep my voice steady. What do you mean? I'm in the car right now, headed home. The voice on the phone seemed confused. No, I'm at the spot where you were supposed to be picked up. I've been waiting here for a while. I looked at the driver again, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road, but there was no indication that anything was off with him. I could feel the anxiety rising in my chest. This didn't make sense. If the driver in the car with me wasn't the one I had ordered, then who was he? And why would he be pretending to be my driver? I glanced at the app on my phone again. It still showed that my Uber ride was in progress. I was still in the car with someone, but I had no idea who this man really was. And if my real Uber driver was still waiting for me, then how had I ended up in this car? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Are you sure you're at the right place? I asked the voice on the phone, hoping it was all some mistake. Yes, I'm sure. I'm right where you were supposed to meet me. Are you not there? The voice was insistent, a little more agitated now. Where are you? I'm waiting. I was panicking now. My stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't keep my voice steady anymore, but I tried anyway. I'm already in a car. I'm on my way home. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice spoke again, quieter now, as though they were unsure of something. Are you sure? Because I'm still at the pickup spot, and it's just me here. I hung up the phone before they could say anything else. I felt like I was going to be sick. The quiet hum of the car's engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires against the road seemed louder now, almost deafening. My thoughts were spinning. I had to figure out what to do, but I didn't know what was real anymore. I looked at the man driving me again. He hadn't seemed strange at first, but now everything felt wrong. His calm demeanor, the way he focused so intensely on the road, the fact that he wasn't saying anything to reassure me, everything about the situation was beginning to make me feel uneasy. The air in the car felt thick, and I couldn't help but stare at him. What if he wasn't my Uber driver? What if he had picked me up by mistake, or worse, what if he had picked me up on purpose? I didn't know how this man knew I was in his car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on the ride, tried to calm myself down, but the thought of getting out of the car started to fill my mind. I could ask him to pull over and get out, but I wasn't sure if that was a good idea either. Would that make him angry? Would he do something? I didn't know if I could trust him. My mind raced as I stared out the window, my hands gripped tightly on my phone, and my body tense with fear. The car sped through the streets, the lights blurring past in a flash. But I didn't feel safe. I kept glancing back at him in the rearview mirror, trying to read his face, trying to see any hint of what he was planning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed and turned onto my street. My apartment was only a few blocks away, and I started to feel a little relief. Maybe this was all just a weird misunderstanding. Maybe I had overthought everything, and I was just being paranoid. But the moment the car stopped in front of my building, I didn't get out right away. Something told me to wait. To just take a second. The driver turned to me then, smiling. It was a forced smile, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Here we are," he said. "Have a good night." I didn't respond right away. My brain was working overtime, trying to process everything. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat in my ears as I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and stepped out of the car. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I glanced back at the driver one more time. He was still watching me with that strange, almost too calm expression on his face. I didn't want to look back as I walked to my apartment. I didn't want to even think about the ride or what had just happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I got inside, I checked my phone again. The Uber app was still open, and the ride was marked as completed. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A notification popped up saying, "Your ride is arriving." The hairs on my neck stood up, and I froze. It didn't make sense. I'd just gotten out of the car. I've been sitting here for hours, staring at the screen, still not fully believing what I saw. I don't even know where to start. I guess it all began about a month ago when I decided to upgrade my home security system. The old system had been fine for years, but I wanted to make sure I had the latest technology after hearing about a few break-ins in the neighborhood. So, I ordered a new camera system, a couple of extra motion detectors, and some smart locks for the doors. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I had no idea what I was setting myself up for. The new system was set up just a few days before everything started. It was pretty easy, honestly. The cameras went up, the app was all synced up, and I even got notifications on my phone when someone walked by. It made me feel safe, at least, for the first few days. I went to bed that night thinking I'd made the right choice, thinking I'd finally done something to make sure my house was as secure as it could be. It was around midnight when I got the first alert. My phone buzzed, waking me up from a deep sleep. It was one of those notifications from the front camera. I thought it was probably a raccoon or something, maybe a cat, just sniffing around the yard. But when I opened the app and checked the live feed, I saw something I wasn't expecting. A person, standing at my front door. I wasn't scared at first. I thought maybe someone was just lost, or maybe it was a neighbor or someone asking for directions. I watched the video feed closely. The person was just standing there, perfectly still, staring at the door. It didn't seem like they were doing anything dangerous. They didn't even try to knock or ring the bell. I shrugged it off at first and decided to go back to sleep. But then, something strange happened. I got another alert. And another. Over the next half hour, the alerts kept coming in. Someone was still standing there. I rubbed my eyes and checked the footage again. The same figure, still standing at the door. No movement, nothing that looked like an attempt to enter or any signs of urgency. Just standing there. It wasn't like someone was waiting to knock or was in a hurry. No, this person just stood there, staring at the door. It wasn't even like they were trying to be discreet. They didn't look like they were hiding. They just stood, staring, like they had all the time in the world. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but another part of me told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they were just waiting for someone, or maybe they were confused about the house. I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing, but at the same time, something didn't sit right with me. I decided to watch the footage more carefully, and that's when I started noticing other details. The person wasn't moving at all. Not a twitch, not a shift of weight. For a whole hour, they were standing there, and they didn't even seem to need a break. I checked the time. It was already past 1:30 a.m. I couldn't stop thinking about it. How could someone just stand there for so long without moving? I kept thinking about what would happen if I went outside to confront them. Would they run off? Would they still be standing there when I opened the door? It was so bizarre. I decided I needed to check the doorbell camera footage. Maybe I'd missed something, some sort of reason for this person's strange behavior. But when I checked the doorbell camera, I was stunned. There was no footage. The bell hadn't been rung. No one had even approached the door in the normal way you would expect if someone were waiting to come in or knock. I went back to the live feed from the front camera again, and there the person was still standing there. No movement. No knock. They weren't even touching the door. It was like they were waiting for something. Waiting for me? Or waiting for something else? I don't know. I couldn't explain it. At this point, I was really freaked out. I was wide awake now, my heart racing. I checked the app again, and the person was still there. I kept thinking about what I should do next. Should I go outside and confront them? Should I call the police? I didn't even know what to say. I didn't want to call the police over something as vague as this, but I couldn't just ignore it either. Something felt deeply wrong. So I did what anyone in a situation like this would do. I called a friend. I didn't know who else to turn to. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for thinking this was weird. I needed reassurance. I'll never forget what she said when I told her what was going on. You're sure they're not just standing there waiting for someone to answer the door, right? It sounds kind of normal, right? She tried to sound casual, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. I told her again that it didn't feel right. The person was too still, too patient, and still no ringing of the bell. She didn't say much after that, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice too. I told her I'd call her back after I figured it out. That's when I decided to check the front yard again, to see if maybe there was something I was missing. I opened the front door slowly, holding my phone out in front of me to monitor the live feed. I didn't know if I should be scared or cautious, or maybe just curious, but I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. Nothing. No one. The figure that had been standing at my door for hours was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere in the yard. I looked down the street to the left and right. It was quiet, like it had been when I first went to bed. But I was still on edge. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't checked the footage again. I probably would have gone to sleep, thinking it was all just my imagination. But I checked it one last time. And that's when I saw it. The person hadn't moved from the doorway all night, but the footage showed them standing up straight just before disappearing from the view of the camera. And that was the last thing I saw before the camera went dark. The doorbell hadn't rung, the door hadn't been knocked on, and the cameras had been working fine except for that brief moment where the feed cut out. I never went back to sleep that night. The whole rest of the night, I kept watching the cameras, checking the footage. Nothing happened after that. No more motion alerts, no more strange figures, just the occasional car passing by. I've changed the passwords for my security system since then. I've made sure everything is locked up tight. But I still can't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, and I don't know who they were or what they wanted. To this day, I can't explain why that person was standing at my door for hours. I don't know if it was someone playing a prank or something much worse, but it still gives me chills when I think about it. I've been trying to move on, but I keep checking the footage every now and then, just to be sure. I guess I'm scared that one day, the cameras will go dark again, and I won't be able to see what happens next. It started a few weeks ago, when I first noticed the van. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first, just a white van, nondescript and parked across the street from the campus. I saw it every day for a few days, parked in the same spot, always around the same time when I was heading to class. At first, I thought it was just some delivery vehicle or someone's car that they use for work. Nothing unusual about that. But after a while, I started noticing that it was always there. It seemed like the same van, same spot, same time. It didn't stick out much, but I guess I started paying more attention than I should have. One evening, after class, I was walking home through the campus like I always did. I didn't usually think twice about the route. It was well lit, familiar, and I knew it was safe. But that night, something felt off. As I passed the usual spots, I noticed the white van parked at the same place again. But this time, something was different. The van's headlights were on. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I glanced at the driver's seat, but it was empty. The van sat there, motionless, like it had been waiting. I shook it off. I mean, I had no reason to think anything was wrong. But as I walked down the block and made a left onto my street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I don't know why, but I glanced over my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the van slowly pulling out of its spot. I couldn't believe it. It was moving now, slowly, without a single turn signal. Just creeping along behind me. My pace picked up, and so did the van's. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, staying just a few car lengths behind me, matching my every move. I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but it was too exact. I made another turn onto the side street that would take me to my building. The van followed. The headlights were still on, casting an eerie glow onto the pavement, but the driver didn't honk or do anything that seemed overtly suspicious. They were just there. Tailgating. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. That people took turns in a similar way sometimes. But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. My steps quickened again, but I still couldn't escape the feeling that the van was behind me, matching me turn for turn. I looked up ahead, hoping to see the familiar side of my apartment complex in the distance, but there was no comfort in the sight of it. The van was still there, still following. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. I didn't want to make a scene or panic. I wasn't even sure if the van's driver knew I had noticed them, but something in me told me I wasn't just imagining things. I wasn't going to let it go. I turned the corner once more, walking quickly, my mind racing. Maybe if I kept my cool, everything would be fine. But then, just as I thought I might make it to my apartment without incident, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a car stopping right behind me. I didn't even have to look to know it was the van. My pulse spiked, and I froze. I didn't know what to do next. I thought about running, but I wasn't sure where to run to. The streets were deserted, and my apartment building was just ahead, but the van was still there, still idling behind me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk a little faster. Then, I heard the van's engine rev slightly. It was subtle, but it was there, almost like the driver was getting ready to do something. I kept walking, but my mind was racing. What if I was being followed? What if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to turn into a dead-end street or an alley? I couldn't take that risk. I had to get to my building, where there were people, where I could be safe. I turned the corner, trying to pick up my pace. The van was still behind me. I didn't look back, but I could feel the weight of it on my neck. I made it to my building's front door, and I didn't even hesitate. I yanked it open and hurried inside. I glanced over my shoulder just in time to see the white van's headlights dim as it pulled away, but not before it turned down the street toward the intersection. It didn't follow me into the parking lot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just avoided something very bad. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the whole situation in my head, trying to figure out if I was being paranoid or if there was something real to be worried about. The van hadn't followed me directly into my building, but I couldn't be sure if that was just a coincidence or if the driver had realized they'd been noticed. I couldn't stop wondering who was behind the wheel, what they wanted, why they followed me. The next morning, I told myself it was just a freaky experience. That maybe it was just a driver on their way home, and they happened to be going the same way as me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The van hadn't been there before, and I never saw it again. But every time I walked home from campus, my eyes kept flicking over to where I'd seen it parked before, waiting for it to reappear. Every time a car slowed down behind me on the street, my heart would race. I didn't see the van again after that night, but I couldn't stop wondering. If it had been coincidence that one time, would I have noticed it the second time? What if the van had followed me again? What if I hadn't gotten inside in time? I couldn't let go of those thoughts, and maybe that's the most unsettling thing of all. I didn't know if I was being stalked or if I had just let my mind run wild. I didn't have answers. But I'll never forget that feeling, the one where every step I took, the van was still right behind me. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I guess, like most people, I always thought things like this were just stories you hear from friends or things you read online. But what I found that night in the freezer, I can't shake off, even now. It started when I got the job at this small, family-owned restaurant. It was my first real job, and I was excited. The place wasn't very big, but it had a good reputation, and people seemed to love it. The owners were nice enough, and I got along with the other employees. They were all older than me, but they were pretty chill, always joking around, making me feel welcome. The only one who seemed a little off was Jeff. He was the manager, a guy in his mid-30s, always a little distant, a little gruff. He never made small talk, just gave orders and went about his business. Everyone else seemed to like him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about him. One of the first things Jeff told me when I started was that I needed to be careful about the freezer in the basement. He told me never, under any circumstances, to open it. Keep the door locked, and don't go poking around in there, he said, his voice serious, his eyes not meeting mine. Just trust me, it's not something you want to mess with. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it was an old restaurant, maybe just one of those quirky rules that didn't really make sense. I figured it was probably something personal, like some kind of weird superstition or something. So, I shrugged it off and continued my work. The freezer itself was in the basement, tucked away behind a metal door at the back of the storage area. The basement was always cold, even in the summer, and the freezer was one of those old ones with a heavy, industrial lock on it. I hadn't thought about it much until one night when the restaurant was especially slow. We had a few customers left, but it was quiet, and I had time to think. I was doing my usual rounds, cleaning up the kitchen, and I found myself standing near the basement door. I hadn't even realized how long I'd been standing there, just staring at that locked door. Something about it just felt wrong. The air in the basement was different, like there was something hidden down there that no one wanted anyone to find. I don't know why, but that night, curiosity got the best of me. I told myself I'd just take a quick look at nothing too big. I had the key to the basement, so getting into the freezer wasn't a problem. I don't know if I was looking for trouble or if it was just the fact that I'd been told not to do something, but I walked down to the basement. The lock on the freezer was old, and I remember the key feeling heavier in my hand than usual as I turned it. The metal groaned as I unlocked it, and I hesitated. For a moment, I almost talked myself out of it, but then I pushed the door open. Inside was cold. It wasn't surprising, considering it was a freezer, but there was something about the temperature that felt wrong. Like it was colder than it should have been. The light flickered as I stepped inside, and my breath fogged up in front of me as I walked through the narrow aisle between the stacked boxes of frozen food. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, maybe some old meat or spoiled food, but what I did find, I wasn't ready for it. There, tucked away in the back corner of the freezer, were stacks of old papers. They were crumpled and yellowed, and as I stepped closer, I saw what they were: missing person posters. Dozens of them, all over the floor, piled up like someone had just tossed them aside. Each poster had a picture of a person. Some of them were fairly recent, but others were old, like they were from decades ago. The faces stared up at me, frozen in time, with their ages, heights, and the words missing at the top. The dates ranged from just a few months ago to some from years back. The names were different, but there was one thing in common. They were all from the local area. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the posters. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. The air around me seemed to get colder, if that was even possible. I could almost hear the soft hum of the freezer, but it felt like something else was in the room with me. I looked around, almost expecting someone to jump out at me, but I was alone. Just me, the posters, and the silence. But as I looked at the names and faces, something inside me clicked. I knew some of these people. Not personally, but I recognized the names from news stories, from missing person reports in the local papers. Some of them had disappeared years ago, but some had gone missing just months before. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back toward the door, something caught my eye. It was a fresh poster, one that wasn't there before. I bent down to pick it up, and my heart sank as I read the name, Evan Price. I knew that name too. Evan was one of the waiters at the restaurant. He had been working there for a few months before he suddenly stopped showing up one day. No one knew what had happened to him. The police didn't have any leads, and eventually, Everyone just assumed he'd left town. But here he was, staring back at me from the poster, his face frozen in time just like the others. I dropped the poster and backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out of that basement. I had to get away from that freezer. But before I could leave, I heard something from behind me. A sound I will never forget. The sound of the lock turning. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and saw the freezer door begin to close on its own. I didn't waste any time. I ran up the stairs, not even looking back until I was safely outside, gasping for air. I didn't know what I had just discovered, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I haven't gone back to that restaurant since. I don't know what Jeff meant by telling me to never open that freezer. But now I understand why. Something is in there. And I'm not the first person to find it. I just hope I'm the last. I've been trying to tell myself that it was just a fluke, that it was nothing, but I can't shake it. I keep replaying it in my head, over and over, and every time I do, I get this cold feeling in my stomach. I've never been so scared in my life. It all started when I booked a last-minute hotel room on a work trip. I had flown to a small city for a conference, and everything was pretty standard. I'd never been to this part of the country before, but the conference was great, and I was enjoying my time. The hotel was nice enough, nothing special, but clean, and it seemed safe. I stayed in a quiet part of town, and the place had decent reviews. I was by myself, so I figured I'd get a solid night's sleep after dinner and then head back to the conference the next day. I had gone out to eat at a nearby restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a small, local place where I could grab a bite and then head back to the hotel. The walk back wasn't long, just a few blocks, and the weather was cool, which I liked. When I got back to the hotel, I swiped my card to unlock the door and stepped into the room. That's when I noticed something was off. My suitcase, my big red one, the one I'd left in the middle of the room by the desk, wasn't where I'd left it. It was no longer in the center of the room. It had been moved, pushed up against the bed near the corner. At first, I thought maybe I had just misplaced it, or maybe I had left it there by accident. I mean, I was tired, and sometimes I do forget where I put things. But no, there was no way. I had definitely left it right by the desk when I'd walked out. I don't know why, but something about it set off a small alarm in my head. It wasn't just the suitcase. There was something about the room. It felt different. The air seemed heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. I walked toward the suitcase and bent down to check if anything was missing. It didn't look like everything was in place. The zipper was still done up, and nothing seemed out of place inside the bag. But I was unsettled now. It wasn't like I had just left the suitcase there by mistake. Someone had moved it. Maybe it was housekeeping. Maybe they'd come in while I was out for dinner and thought they needed to tidy up or something. It was the only explanation that made sense. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone from the desk, intending to check my messages and try to shake off the creeping feeling in my stomach. But before I could unlock the screen, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift of shadows under the bed. But then, it was there, a hand. Slowly, so slowly, a hand began to slide out from under the bed. The fingers were long and pale, and I swear I could see every knuckle as it crept forward. The hand didn't jerk out. It didn't come out in a rush. It was deliberate, like it was trying to be as quiet and unnoticed as possible. I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, but nothing seemed to make sense. The hand moved so deliberately, like it had been waiting there for so long, and now it was finally making its move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed. The fingers kept stretching out, almost gently, as if testing the air around it. My hand was still gripping my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I couldn't even yell, even though every part of me was screaming. I just stared at that hand as it slowly inched forward. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab my things and leave, but I knew I couldn't just turn my back on whatever that was. I was rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do, waiting for the hand to reveal its owner, or maybe I was afraid to find out who or what it was. The hand stopped moving for a moment, and everything went silent. The weight of the moment was suffocating. My fingers trembled, and my heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I knew that I needed to get out of that room, but I couldn't make myself move. I felt like I was in a nightmare where I couldn't scream or run or do anything. Then, I heard a soft shuffle. The hand started to retract, pulling itself back under the bed, as if whatever it was didn't want to be seen. I snapped out of my trance. I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. I turned toward the door, but as I did, my foot caught on the edge of the carpet, and I stumbled forward, just barely catching myself before I hit the ground. My phone slipped from my hand, and I heard it land with a thud against the floor. That was enough to break the silence. The shuffle under the bed stopped, and I heard a low, rasping breath, like someone trying to stay quiet but failing. It was the sound of someone hiding, trying not to be noticed. I didn't waste any more time. I ran. I grabbed my phone off the floor, ignoring the shaking of my hands, and rushed out of the room. I didn't even stop to close the door behind me. I was already halfway down the hallway before I realized I hadn't even called the police. But I didn't want to go back in there, and I didn't want to confront whatever had been under that bed. I took the elevator down to the lobby, my heart racing. The front desk clerk looked at me like I was crazy when I walked up to her, but I didn't care. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I just told her I wanted a new room. A new floor. Away from that one. She didn't argue. She gave me another room without hesitation, but I could see the way her eyes flicked to the manager behind her as if they were sharing some unspoken knowledge. When I got into the new room, I locked the door and immediately pushed the dresser in front of it, just to feel a little safer. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I've slept properly since. The next morning, I checked out early. I never went back to that room, and I never asked about what had happened. I didn't want to know. But I know what I saw. That hand. That sound. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a trick of the light. There was someone who had been hiding in that room, waiting. I don't know who they were or why they were there, but I don't ever want to find out. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I've always considered myself cautious, but looking back now, I realize I might have been too trusting. This all started a few weeks ago, and I've had trouble shaking it off since. It all began when I started walking to work. I live in a small town, and the commute is short, maybe 20 minutes on foot. It's a nice walk through some quiet streets and a couple of parks. I've always enjoyed the morning air, the calm before the day starts. I'm one of those people who likes to get up a bit earlier than necessary, so I had the streets mostly to myself. One morning, I noticed a white van behind me as I walked. It wasn't anything too unusual. There are plenty of vans around here, especially with construction work and delivery trucks. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been following me for longer than a simple coincidence. It kept pace, staying a few car lengths behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a van on a route, like the others. The next day, it happened again. I noticed the same van, white with no markings, right behind me. Same time, same place. Again, I brushed it off, but this time, I started paying a little more attention. As I walked, I tried to glance back casually, and I noticed that the van didn't seem to be going anywhere else. It just stayed there, following me down the street. The third day was when things started to feel strange. I decided to change my route to see if it was just a coincidence. I took a different street, one I usually don't use in the mornings. To my surprise, the van was still behind me, a few blocks away. It had followed me down the new street. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way it could just be a coincidence now, right? That night, I thought about it, tried to reason with myself. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably a delivery van, I convinced myself. Maybe it was just in the area. But I couldn't shake that feeling, the one you get when something doesn't seem right. I still had to walk to work the next day, so I tried to ignore it and focus on getting to the office. But the next day, it happened again. The same white van was following me. This time, I stopped for a moment and tried to look back without making it obvious. I saw the driver clearly for the first time. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just driving slowly, as if waiting for me to move. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. There was no way I could keep pretending it was a coincidence. I decided to confront him. The following morning, I waited until I was a few blocks from my office. I made sure to glance back, and sure enough, the van was still there. I waited until we were at a stoplight and then turned sharply down an alleyway that led to a less busy street. My idea was to get off the main road and see if the van would follow. It did. It followed me down the alley, then onto the quieter street. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. I wanted answers. I didn't stop walking, but I turned onto a side street where I knew there was a busier corner with people around. I glanced back, and there it was again, the van, still following me. I took a deep breath, then made my move. I quickly crossed the street and stood in front of a small cafe, pretending to look at the menu posted outside. As I waited, I saw the van slowly drive by, the driver turning his head to look at me as he passed. I knew this was my chance. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and started walking toward the van, trying to act calm, like I knew exactly what I was doing. The van slowed down and eventually stopped. The driver rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. I tried to sound confident as I asked, "Why have you been following me for the past few days?" His expression didn't change. He just stared at me for a moment, as if sizing me up, then shrugged. "I'm just in the area. I'm working nearby." "Working where?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. He shifted in his seat, but I could tell he was getting nervous. "I work for a delivery company. You know, just driving around. Nothing special." I didn't buy it. The van had no markings, and I couldn't see any delivery equipment inside. It looked like a plain, white van with tinted windows. "You've been following me for days. That's not normal." He just smiled, a bit too wide, like he was trying to stay calm. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just a coincidence." You're making a big deal out of nothing. I stood there for a moment, staring at him. There was something about the way he was acting that made my skin crawl. His eyes weren't right, there was a coldness to them that I didn't trust. It felt like he was lying, but I couldn't pin it down. My hands were shaking now, and I realized I needed to get away from him. I don't believe you, I said, taking a step back. I'm calling the police if you don't leave. The man hesitated for a moment, then started to roll up the window. Fine, whatever, he said, his voice suddenly sounding annoyed. You're crazy. And with that, he drove off. I watched the van disappear down the street, my heart still racing. I stood there for a while, trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know who he was or why he was following me, but I had a horrible feeling that he wasn't going to stop. I called a friend as soon as I could, and I told her everything. She suggested I talk to the police, but I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously. After all, I didn't have much proof, just a feeling that something was off. But I couldn't keep living like this, so I filed a report anyway, just in case. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't seen the van again. But I still don't feel safe. Every time I leave my house, I check my surroundings, and I still sometimes feel like I'm being watched. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I know I can't just forget about this. I don't walk the same route to work anymore. I change it up every day now, just in case. And I'll never forget the look in that driver's eyes. I had never been a fan of street performances, but a friend of mine convinced me to go to one. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the street was filled with people wandering about, enjoying the sunlight. A man was performing near the park, juggling and doing tricks that seemed to draw a crowd. I didn't expect much, just figured I'd stop by for a few minutes to kill time, maybe grab a coffee afterward. I leaned against a nearby wall, watching him for a bit. His performance was impressive, he was good with his tricks, and the crowd seemed entertained. But there was something about him that caught my attention. It wasn't just the way he moved or how skilled he was at juggling, it was the way he kept making eye contact with me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just performing to the crowd, trying to make everyone feel like they were part of the show. But every time I looked away, I could feel his gaze on me. And when I looked back, his eyes were locked onto mine. It wasn't like he was being subtle about it, either. It was intense, almost too intense. It made me uncomfortable. After a few minutes, I figured it was time to leave, so I walked away and headed toward the cafe nearby. But as I walked, I could feel my heart racing for no reason. I told myself it was just the anxiety of being in a crowd, but something about that moment stuck with me. The next morning, I was at my usual cafe. It was a quiet Sunday, not many people around. I ordered my coffee and found a seat near the window. I wasn't expecting to see anyone I knew. But when I looked up, I saw him. The same man from the street performance was sitting at a table near the back. He was looking right at me, not in a casual way, but in the same way he had looked at me the day before. I froze for a second, unsure if I should make eye contact or look away. But he didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, just like they had on the street. It felt like my chest was tightening. I got up quickly and left, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he liked this cafe too. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me somehow. The next day, I went to the gym. It was early, so the place was mostly empty. I did my usual workout, tried not to think too much about what had happened over the last few days. I didn't see him at first, and I told myself that maybe I was just overthinking everything. But then, as I was stretching on the mat near the back, I glanced up and there he was, standing by the weights, watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, just like the last 2 times. I didn't know if I should be scared, angry, or confused. My stomach turned. I tried to keep it together and not let it show that I was uncomfortable. But it was hard. I finished my workout quickly and left without really paying attention to what I was doing. I was in a daze, just wanting to get out of there. I convinced myself that he had just been a regular person at the gym. I tried to make excuses. But when I walked out, he was standing outside the gym, watching me. I didn't want to make a scene, so I hurried to my car, my heart racing. I locked the doors as soon as I got in. I tried to breathe, to calm myself down, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every place I went, he seemed to be there. I went to the grocery store, he was standing by the checkout. I stopped by a different cafe, he was sitting at a table near the window, staring at me. One day, I was walking out of my workplace, and I saw him across the street, leaning against a building, watching me. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It was like he was following me, waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge him. And each time, he would look at me with that same intense gaze. It felt like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move, to say something, to respond. But I had no idea what he wanted. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the places I usually went. I didn't know if it was paranoia, but I started to feel like I was being watched constantly. Every shadow, every stranger's glance felt like it could be him. It became harder to ignore. One night, I decided to go out with a friend, hoping that a change of scenery would take my mind off things. I went to a bar in a different part of town, a place I'd never been before. It was busy, but I figured the crowd would make me feel safer. I wanted to forget the last few days, to just have a normal night. But as soon as I walked in, I froze. There he was, sitting at the bar, as if waiting for me. He turned and looked directly at me, that same intense gaze. My stomach dropped. I didn't know how he had found me, but there he was, like he had been there all along, like I was the one who was being followed, not the other way around. I couldn't handle it anymore. I told my friend I wasn't feeling well, and we left immediately. As we stepped outside, I turned to look down the street one last time. He was standing across the road, just standing there, staring at me. It was like he had been waiting for me to leave. I didn't know what to do. I didn't feel safe anymore. I started to think about moving, changing my routine completely, getting as far away from this man as I could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step ahead of me. I don't know if he ever stopped following me, but after that night, I started avoiding going out at all. I didn't want to go to the places I used to visit, and even when I did go out, I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. He was always somewhere in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I stopped seeing him after a while, but the feeling never went away. I don't know if he was just a strange man with too much time on his hands, or if he was something more, but I haven't been able to forget about him. Every time I see someone glance at me a little too long, I get nervous. I keep thinking about those eyes, always watching, always waiting. I never thought much about my neighbors. I've lived in the same apartment for a few years now, and the walls are thin, so you get used to the usual noises, people walking, a door slamming, music playing softly through the walls. It's just city life. But then, about a month ago, I started hearing things that made my skin crawl. At first, it was subtle. It would happen late at night, when everything was quiet. I'd be in bed, almost asleep, when I'd hear a soft thudding sound coming from the apartment next door. At first, I thought it was just someone dropping something or moving furniture, but it didn't stop. It would go on for hours, sometimes getting louder, almost like someone was pacing back and forth, but without any real pattern. The noises started getting more disturbing after a while. I started hearing scraping sounds, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The sounds were erratic, almost like something was being knocked over, followed by the sound of quick footsteps. I tried to ignore it for a few days, telling myself it was just a neighbor doing something at odd hours, but it started to affect me. I couldn't sleep. The noises were getting too consistent, too strange. One night, around 2 a.m., the sound of dragging and shuffling woke me up again. I had enough by that point. I got dressed, threw on my slippers, and decided to knock on my neighbor's door. I wasn't sure if I should, but I had to ask what was going on. I knocked 3 times, waited a moment, and knocked again. I was about to give up when I finally heard footsteps approaching from the other side. The door opened just a crack, and I saw the face of my neighbor for the first time. He was a man in his early 30s, tall, thin, and wearing a gray hoodie, his eyes wide and a little tired looking. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice a bit shaky, like he was startled. I cleared my throat and said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been hearing strange noises coming from your apartment at night. It's been going on for a while now, and it's making it hard to sleep." He looked at me for a second, and then his face softened, like he was trying to be understanding. "Oh, I'm sorry about that. It's just, I've been moving some stuff around. You know, rearranging things. It's probably just the furniture being shifted." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but I didn't want to push it too hard. "Okay. I just thought I should mention it. It sounds a little strange sometimes, like something's dragging or being knocked over." He smiled awkwardly. "I get it. I'm really sorry. I'll try to keep it down. I'll be more careful with the furniture. Thanks for letting me know." I smiled back, still unsure, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. "All right, thanks. Good night." He shut the door, and I went back to my apartment. That night, the noises didn't come. For a couple of days, things seemed normal. But then, a week later, it started again. This time, it was worse. There was that dragging sound, then what sounded like a heavy object falling to the floor, followed by a weird, muffled thumping. It went on for hours, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was losing sleep, feeling paranoid, and I couldn't get the thought out of my head, what is going on over there? I decided to knock again. It was late, probably around midnight this time. I had barely knocked once when the door opened. He was standing there, still in the same gray hoodie, his eyes wide, but now with a strange, almost nervous energy. "Oh, it's you," he said, sounding surprised but not upset. "Is everything all right?" "I can hear it again," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The noises. It's still going on. And it's getting worse. I just don't understand what's happening." He shifted his weight uncomfortably and glanced around, like he was looking for an escape. "Yeah, sorry about that. It's just... I've been doing some repairs in the apartment. Fixing stuff, you know? I told you I was moving things around, but I guess it's just louder than I thought." His explanation didn't make any sense. I'd lived here for years, and I knew that building. Repairs don't sound like that. I knew what tools and noises came with repairs, and this wasn't it. There was a weirdness to the way he said it, like he was being evasive, like he didn't want to tell me something. I'm not sure I believe that, I said slowly. This isn't just furniture or repairs. It sounds like something's being dragged. Like someone's pacing or... I said I'm sorry. I'll do my best to keep it down, he interrupted quickly. Don't worry about it. I hesitated for a moment, looking at him. He wasn't making eye contact, and his hands were fidgeting in his hoodie pockets. I didn't want to press him further, but I had this sinking feeling that something wasn't right. Okay, I said, backing away from the door. But if it doesn't stop, I'll have to let management know. This is becoming a problem. Of course. I understand. I'll take care of it, he said, still not looking me in the eye. I didn't feel any better. There was something off about him, but I didn't want to escalate it. I walked back to my apartment, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, I was in the kitchen when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was already late in the evening. I opened the door, and there he was again, standing awkwardly in the hallway. Hey, he said, forcing a smile. I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay with the noise and everything. I didn't want you to feel uncomfortable. I can hear you sometimes through the walls, too, and I didn't mean to disturb you. I felt my heart race. I had only spoken to him twice, yet now he was knocking on my door for no reason, checking on me. It didn't feel right. I took a step back, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm fine. Just, please keep the noise down. I don't need any more late-night disturbances. Of course. Of course, he said quickly. But then he added, if you ever need anything, or if the noise keeps up, you can always come to me. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Thanks, but really, it's fine. Just keep it down. As I closed the door, I could see him standing there, still smiling that weird, forced smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than a neighbor should. The next few days were a blur, with him showing up uninvited twice more. The first time, he just stood outside my door for a few minutes, then knocked and asked if I was okay. The second time, he lingered in the hallway, pretending to check his mail but glancing at my apartment door every few seconds. It didn't take long for me to realize the noises weren't just random anymore. He was making them. I don't know why or what his intentions were, but I knew that I wasn't going to wait around and find out. I started staying with a friend for a few nights and reported his behavior to the building manager. Eventually, the landlord got involved, and after some investigation, it turned out that the man had a history of strange behavior with previous tenants. I don't know exactly what went down, but after a few weeks, he was moved out. I still live in the same building, but every now and then, I hear noises at night, and I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. I've learned to trust my instincts now, and I always keep my door locked, just in case. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in my apartment again after what happened a few weeks ago. It started out as a normal evening. I just finished work and was relaxing in front of the TV, mindlessly flipping through channels. I live in a third-floor apartment in an older building. It's in a quiet neighborhood, and the windows face a small alley. Nothing unusual ever happens here, and I've always felt pretty secure. But that night was different. Around 10:30, I heard a faint noise. It was subtle at first, just a slight tapping, like something brushing against the window. I didn't think much of it. I've always been a little jumpy, so I figured it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch. I continued watching TV, but the noise kept happening, getting a little louder with each pass. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't wind. It felt intentional. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little to peek outside. My heart skipped a beat when I saw someone climbing up the fire escape. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their figure as they moved up, one slow step after another. My mind was racing, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront them? I knew I was alone, and the building was quiet. If something went wrong, there wouldn't be anyone around to help. I quickly backed away from the window and grabbed my phone. I didn't want to make any noise, but I knew I needed to call someone. My hands were shaking so badly I had to steady myself against the wall. I dialed 911, but before I could hit send, I heard the fire escape creak again. Whoever was climbing it was almost at my window. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. The seconds felt like hours, but I stayed still, too scared to make a sound. I didn't know if the person was just going to stop once they reached the top, or if they were planning to climb into my apartment. I had no idea what they wanted, and that terrified me even more. I was in a panic, my mind jumping between possibilities, none of them good. Suddenly, I heard the sound of someone's hand grabbing the metal rung of the fire escape. Then, a scraping noise, metal against metal, as they shifted. I froze. The last thing I wanted was for whoever it was to know that I was in here, watching them. I had no idea what they intended, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I had no choice but to act. I wasn't going to just stand there and wait for something worse to happen. I tiptoed over to the window, making sure I stayed as quiet as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest as I peered through the blinds. The person was standing on the fire escape now, just a few feet away from my window. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could make out the shape of a man in dark clothes, just standing there. I wasn't sure what to do. My phone was still in my hand, but I didn't want to make a noise. I slowly started to back away from the window to grab my keys, thinking I should leave, get out of the apartment, but before I could move, I heard the voice. "Hey, you in there?" It was a man's voice. I felt like my heart was going to stop. He knew I was there. I didn't know how to respond. I thought about running to the door, but it would be too loud. And besides, what if he followed me? What if he was already inside by the time I got downstairs? I needed to stay calm. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound confident, though my voice shook. The man paused for a second. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I think I got the wrong apartment. I was looking for someone else." The words caught me off guard. He wasn't trying to break in. He wasn't planning anything violent. But why was he on my fire escape, then? Why was he acting like it was normal to be on my window ledge in the middle of the night? "I don't think so," I said, stepping forward cautiously, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want?" "I'm just looking for someone," he repeated, his tone strangely calm. "I didn't mean to scare you. I'll leave now." But he didn't move. He just stood there, facing the window, like he was waiting for me to do something. I could feel my stomach knotting, my instinct screaming that something was wrong. "You need to go," I said, this time with more force, my hand gripping the phone tightly in my pocket. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I had no intention of letting him anywhere near me. Finally, he stepped back, slowly. I watched him take a few steps down the fire escape before he turned and started climbing down the building. I couldn't let myself relax just yet, though. I stayed by the window for another few minutes, staring out, making sure he wasn't coming back or trying to sneak into a different window. When I was sure he was gone, I called the police. I told them everything, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. They took my statement, and they checked the building, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They said they'd keep an eye on things, but I didn't feel reassured. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called my landlord to ask about security, about the fire escape, anything that could make me feel safer. He assured me it was all secure, that people couldn't get in that way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been trying to get inside. I never saw that man again, but I can't forget how calm he sounded when he said he was looking for someone else. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. Why would he be climbing up a building to find someone, if that wasn't his intent? I don't know what he wanted, but I know I never want to see him again. Since then, I've taken extra precautions, locking my windows, making sure the blinds are closed tight every night. It's silly, maybe, but I can't stop thinking about it. The feeling that I wasn't safe, that someone had been right outside my window waiting, keeps me on edge. I don't know who he was or what he was really after, but I know that night will always haunt me. I work as a handyman, mostly doing odd jobs for rental properties around the city. Most of my work is pretty standard, fixing leaky faucets, repairing drywall, and replacing light fixtures. Nothing ever out of the ordinary. That is, until I got a call about a new property that needed some attention. The landlord was an older guy, one of those quiet types who never seemed to have much to say. He was friendly enough, but I could tell there was something a little off about the place. The property was an old house, maybe 100 years old or so. It had a certain charm to it, with its creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper. The landlord had mentioned that the house had been vacant for a while, but that it was now ready to rent out. He just needed me to go in, check a few things, and make sure everything was in working order before the new tenants arrived. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another job. But there was one thing that stuck with me from the start, the basement door. I didn't think much of it at first, just another door in the house, but when I went down to the basement to check the furnace, I noticed something strange. The door was locked. No big deal, right? You expect some doors to be locked in older houses. But when I asked the landlord about it, he seemed to get uncomfortable. "Ah, the basement, it's nothing. Just some old stuff down there," he said, brushing it off. I wouldn't worry about it. That was the first red flag. He didn't really give me a solid answer, and there was something about the way he said it that felt off. I figured maybe he was just one of those people who didn't want to deal with the old stuff lying around in the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. I went about my work, but that door kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I checked the rest of the house, made the repairs, and kept coming back to that locked door in the basement. Something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding something. I didn't want to pry, but my curiosity kept growing. A couple of weeks went by, and the house was ready to rent. The landlord came by to inspect my work, and everything seemed fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about that locked basement door. I made a mental note to bring it up again, but when I did, the landlord just waved it off. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it," he repeated, almost too quickly. That was when I decided to just let it go. I figured the house was his, and if he didn't want to talk about the basement, it wasn't my place to ask. But deep down, I still couldn't stop thinking about that door. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It just felt like there was something hidden behind it, something the landlord didn't want anyone to know. Then, a few days ago, it happened. I got another call from the landlord. He needed me to come by the house to fix a couple of things, nothing major, just a few minor repairs. I was there working when I noticed that something was different. The basement door was no longer locked. The lock was broken. I'm not sure when it happened, but the door was now wide open. I stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to go down there. I had never been down there before, and the thought of it made my stomach turn. But at the same time, I couldn't resist. Something inside me told me I needed to see what was behind that door. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and headed down the stairs into the basement. The air was damp, and the smell of mold hit me immediately. The basement was dark, just a faint light from the staircase casting shadows on the walls. I stepped forward, scanning the room with my flashlight. The space was filled with old furniture, boxes, and what looked like a bunch of junk, nothing too unusual for a basement. But then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the floorboards creaking, but then I heard it again. A soft sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, holding my breath. The air felt colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer to the corner, I could hear the sound more clearly now. It wasn't a whisper. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark corner of the basement. The flashlight beam flickered for a moment, and I swore I saw something move, just a shadow, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I took another step forward, then stopped. My mind was racing, and I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was down here anymore. The breathing was still there, and it was getting louder, like whatever or whoever was in that corner was getting closer. I couldn't leave. I couldn't just walk away, not after all this. I had to find out what was going on. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I took one more step forward. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small door. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a simple wooden door, nothing special about it, but there was something unsettling about it. The sound of breathing was louder now, more distinct, and it was coming from behind that door. It sounded like someone was inside, waiting. I could feel my palms start to sweat, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should just get out of there and never come back. But something was pulling me toward that door, some primal curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Slowly, I reached out and placed my hand on the door. The wood was cold under my fingers, and the moment I touched it, the breathing stopped. The silence was deafening. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with what I should do next. Then, without thinking, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was small, barely big enough for a person to stand in, and the air inside was thick with dust and mildew. But what stood out the most was what was in the middle of the room, a chair. A worn, old chair, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the straps, the ones tied to the arms and legs of the chair. And the blood. The dark, sticky stains on the floor beneath it. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the room, trying to process what I was seeing. My body felt numb, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who had been down here? And why had the landlord never told me about this? Then, from behind me, I heard the creak of the basement door. Someone was coming down the stairs. I turned, my heart racing, the flashlight clutched in my hand like it was some kind of weapon. But the basement was empty. The door was closed. My stomach twisted as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in that basement with me wasn't gone. It was still there. And it was watching me. The first note was nothing more than a curiosity. I'd moved into this house 3 months ago, drawn to its affordable price and the promise of a quiet neighborhood. The backyard was small but private, bordered by a high wooden fence that separated it from the neighbor's property. I hadn't seen much of the person who lived there, just glimpses of an older man through the slats of the fence when I was out mowing the lawn. He never waved, and I figured he preferred to keep to himself. Fine by me. The note was on plain white paper, folded once and wedged under the bottom edge of the fence. I almost missed it as I was watering the garden one afternoon. Curious, I picked it up and unfolded it. Keep your dog on your side. I didn't have a dog. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe the man next door thought my dog, a dog I didn't have, was getting into his yard. But my yard was fully fenced in, and I hadn't seen so much as a stray animal since I moved in. I set the note aside, figuring it wasn't worth the effort to respond. 2 days later, I found another note in the same spot. Don't think I don't notice what you're doing. That one made me pause. There was no context, no signature. Just those words scrawled in uneven handwriting, as if the person writing it had been shaking. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it must be some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. A week passed without incident, and I started to forget about the notes. Then one evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed something sticking out from under the fence again. Another note. You're not fooling anyone. Stay out of my yard. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I'd never set foot in his yard. I hadn't even tried to peek over the fence. My first instinct was to go knock on his door and clear up whatever confusion he had, but something about the tone of the notes made me hesitate. If he was this paranoid, would showing up at his door make things worse? Instead, I wrote my own note. I kept it short and polite, explaining that I didn't have a dog and had no reason to be in his yard. I slipped it under the fence and went back inside, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next day, there was another note. Nice try. I know what you're really doing. The words sent a chill down my spine. What did he think I was doing? Why wouldn't he just come talk to me if there was a problem? Over the next week, the notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. I see you watching me. Stay away from my house. Don't think I won't defend myself. By this point, I was locking my doors and double-checking the windows at night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside my own home. One night, I stayed up late, hoping to catch whoever was slipping the notes under the fence. I sat by the window that faced the backyard, the lights off, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the other side of the fence. I held my breath, peering into the darkness. A shadow moved along the fence line. I couldn't see much, just the outline of someone hunched over near the ground. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The next morning, I found the worst note yet. I know you're alone. You won't be for long. I went straight to the police. I brought the notes with me, explained the situation, and even mentioned the shadow I'd seen. The officer I spoke to was polite but not particularly helpful. He said they couldn't do much unless there was a direct threat or evidence of a crime. He suggested installing a security camera and keeping an eye out. So that's what I did. I bought a motion-activated camera and set it up in the backyard, aimed at the fence. The first night it recorded nothing but a raccoon rummaging through the bushes. The second night, the camera caught something, or rather, someone. It was the man next door. The footage showed him creeping along the fence line, slipping a folded piece of paper underneath before disappearing back into the darkness. His movements were slow and deliberate, and even on the grainy footage, I could see how hunched and tense he was. I brought the footage back to the police. This time, they took it more seriously. They sent an officer to talk to my neighbor, but when they knocked on his door, no one answered. The officer told me they'd keep an eye on the situation and advised me to stay vigilant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining him watching me, lurking just out of sight. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside, a faint rustling, like someone brushing against the bushes. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. The screen showed the backyard, dimly lit by the porch light. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, movement. He was standing by the fence, staring directly at the camera. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Just stood there, staring. Then he raised his hand, and I saw he was holding a piece of paper. He crouched down, slid it under the fence, and walked away. I didn't go outside to get the note until morning. When I finally unfolded it, my hands were shaking. Soon. That was all it said. Just one word, scrawled in the same uneven handwriting. I didn't stick around to find out what he meant. I packed a bag, called a friend, and left that day. The police promised to keep investigating, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. I don't know what his problem was, or what he thought I'd done. Maybe he was just lonely, or maybe he was truly dangerous. Either way, I wasn't going to wait to find out. We had been looking for a tutor for our son, Liam, for a while. He's always been a bright kid, but lately his grades were slipping, especially in math. We both work full-time, and we thought hiring a tutor would give him the extra help he needed to catch up. We found someone through an online service, a woman named Claire. She had excellent reviews, and her background was impressive. She'd been a teacher for over 10 years and had worked with kids of all ages. She seemed like the perfect fit. The first few sessions went smoothly. Claire was professional, friendly, and very patient with Liam. She came to our house twice a week, and every time, she was on time, well prepared, and stayed the full hour. Liam seemed to be enjoying it, too. He'd talk about the lessons afterward, and we noticed that his attitude toward homework was improving. But then, little things started to change. At first, it wasn't anything that stood out too much. She'd ask questions that were slightly off, but we didn't think much of it. "What time do you guys usually get home from work?" she asked one day as we were wrapping up a lesson. I answered, telling her that my wife and I typically get in around 6:30 p.m. It seemed like a harmless question at the time. But then, over the next couple of weeks, she asked about our routines more and more. "Do you go out often on weekends? How long do you usually spend doing groceries?" It started to feel a little invasive, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just trying to build rapport with Liam, trying to understand his home life better so she could connect with him more. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then came the first instance of something disappearing. One morning, I went to get my car keys from the kitchen counter, and they were gone. I asked my wife if she had moved them. She said she hadn't. I searched the house, thinking I had misplaced them, but I couldn't find them anywhere. I figured I must have been more tired than I thought, so I let it go. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was a pair of earrings my wife had left on the bathroom counter. She couldn't find them. She swore she hadn't touched them, and I was starting to feel unsettled. The feeling of something being off in the house, something I couldn't put my finger on, was growing. Then there were the other things. Small things, like my watch going missing or the TV remote vanishing for a day or two. Sometimes, we'd find things in odd places, like a book that was left on the shelf suddenly turned up on the kitchen table. I didn't say anything to my wife at first, but she noticed too. But it was the day Liam came to me with something that really made my heart race. He was looking through his backpack when he found something strange, a small notebook. It wasn't his, and it wasn't anything we bought. It had a few pages torn out, and some scribbled notes inside. But what caught my attention was the handwriting. It was Claire's. She had written about Liam's progress in the tutoring sessions, yes, but she'd also written down personal details about me and my wife, even about the house. They usually leave at 8 a.m., one note said. Their car is always in the driveway by 6:30 p.m. There were other things too, details that she couldn't have known unless she had been paying close attention, things that went beyond the tutoring sessions. That was when I started connecting the dots. The weird questions, the missing things, the notebook, everything pointed to Claire. She was more than just a tutor. She was watching us. She was taking notes on our lives. We decided to install a security camera in the living room. It wasn't anything too obvious, just a small, hidden camera that would blend in with the decor. I felt like we had no choice. We needed proof. The next time Claire came for a lesson, we pretended everything was normal. I acted like nothing was wrong, but my mind was racing. When I reviewed the footage that night, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Claire had come in, and after a few minutes of tutoring, she started looking around the room. She wasn't paying attention to Liam anymore. She was glancing at the shelves, the counters, the little knickknacks my wife and I had collected over the years. She was even taking mental notes about the places she visited in the house. It was like she was mapping it all out. Then, as she got up to help Liam with something, I saw her glance at the counter where we kept our spare keys. She moved toward it, hesitated, then reached for them. She picked them up, looked at them for a moment, and put them in her bag. That was the moment I knew we had to confront her. We couldn't let it go any longer. I called my wife, and we talked it over. We agreed that we would cancel the next lesson. I'd be home, and I'd confront Claire directly. We didn't want to make it a scene, but we needed to know what was going on. The next day, I texted her and told her we were no longer in need of her services. She responded quickly, thanking us for the opportunity and asking if she could return to pick up her materials. I didn't respond right away, but I was on edge. That night, when Claire arrived to pick up her things, she acted completely normal. She smiled, asked how we were doing, and made small talk. She didn't act like she'd done anything wrong. But when I asked her if she had taken anything from our house, her face went pale. She stammered a little, then said, "What do you mean?" I didn't give her a chance to explain. I asked her directly about the notebook, about the keys, and the missing items. At first, she denied it. But when I told her I had seen the footage, her demeanor changed completely. She became defensive, insisting she had only been looking around because she was curious. She apologized, but there was something in her eyes, something cold, that made me feel uneasy. I told her to leave, and she did. The next day, we called the police. They took the notebook, the camera footage, and statements from us. They told us they'd look into it, but we haven't heard from them since. I don't know if she had any intention of stealing from us or if she was just obsessed with our lives, but I'm glad we found out before things got worse. We've changed the locks and added extra security to the house. Liam's doing better in school, but I'm still not completely comfortable. I'm constantly checking everything now, wondering if we missed anything else. What if there's more we don't know? The worst part is that I don't know why she did it. What was she trying to get from us? What was her end game? The uncertainty is the hardest part to deal with. I still don't know how I made such a stupid mistake. I was tired, distracted, and not paying attention. I don't have a good excuse, but that's what happened. I live in a big apartment complex, the kind where all the hallways look the same, and late at night, it's easy to get turned around. I had been out running errands, came home, and walked up the wrong flight of stairs. I thought I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I got to what I thought was my apartment, the door was cracked open. Not wide, just enough to make me stop for a second. I remember thinking maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way when I left. That happens sometimes, right? I pushed it open and stepped inside without really thinking. The place was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. I could see the TV was on but muted, playing one of those news channels. The layout was the same as mine, living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. It smelled different, for one thing. Not bad, just not familiar. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet, like it didn't belong there. No answer. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice little details. The furniture wasn't arranged like mine. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize. A pair of boots by the door, not mine, not my roommate's. I froze. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of embarrassment hit me. I thought, oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I turned around, ready to bolt back out the door, but before I could move, I heard the lock click. Someone was standing there, just inside the door. I hadn't even heard them come in. It was a man, tall, mid-30s maybe, wearing a heavy jacket like he'd just come in from outside. He was holding a grocery bag in one hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. "What are you doing in here?" he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, staring at me, and then he set the grocery bag down slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment?" he repeated. His tone didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes," I said. My voice felt weak, like it wasn't carrying the words right. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt shut. The sound of it snapping into place made my heart jump. "Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours?" he asked. "I was about to," I said quickly. "I swear, I just realized." "Don't lie to me," he cut in. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, almost angry, but still quiet. He took a step closer, and I stepped back without thinking. My heel hit the edge of a coffee table, and I nearly tripped. "I'm not lying," I said. My voice cracked, and I hated how scared I sounded. I swear, it was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now. He didn't move for a moment, just kept staring at me. Then he nodded slowly, like he was thinking something over. Okay, he said. If it was just a mistake, let's talk about it. Sit down. I don't need to sit down, I said, trying to sound calm. I'll just sit down. It wasn't a request. He wasn't yelling, but the way he said it left no room for argument. I sat on the couch, my hands shaking, and he stayed standing, just watching me. What's your name? He asked. I told him. My voice felt so small in the silence. And you live upstairs? Yes, I said. Just one floor up. What's your apartment number? I told him, hoping he'd believe me, hoping he'd let me leave. He nodded again, slowly, like he was filing the information away. You know, he said, people don't just walk into the wrong apartment. Not by accident. It was an accident, I said, my voice shaking. I swear. I wasn't paying attention. He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to decide if I was worth believing. Then he stepped closer, leaning down so we were at eye level. Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building? He asked. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home? I'm not a thief, I said quickly. I promise, I'm not. You think I don't know what you're doing? He interrupted. You think I don't see it? I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and my chest was tight. I wanted to get up, to push past him and run, but I didn't dare move. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at me. Then he reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. He held it up, like he was going to call someone. I should call the cops, he said. Please don't, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't do anything. I swear. It was just a mistake. He stared at me for another long moment, then lowered the phone. Get out, he said. I didn't wait for him to say it again. I got up and moved toward the door as fast as I could without running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the deadbolt. I felt his eyes on me the whole time. When I finally got the door open, I stepped out into the hallway and turned back. He was still standing there, watching me, his face completely unreadable. He didn't say anything else, just stood there until I closed the door behind me. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked the door the second I was inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It started on a Friday night. I just finished dinner at a small cafe downtown and was walking back to my car when someone brushed past me hard enough to knock my purse from my shoulder. I didn't think much of it at first, just someone in a hurry. But when I bent down to grab it, it wasn't there. The person who'd bumped me was already disappearing around the corner, and I realized they had it. My heart sank. My whole life was in that bag: wallet, keys, phone. I ran after them, but by the time I turned the corner, they were gone. I flagged down a nearby police officer and explained what had happened. He said they'd file a report but didn't sound optimistic about getting it back. I drove home feeling shaken. I canceled my credit cards, locked my phone remotely, and changed some passwords from my laptop. I thought that was the end of it. Annoying, yes, but manageable. I didn't even bother to tell my family. It wasn't worth the stress. The next morning, my mom called. Her voice was tight, like she'd been crying. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, and she sounded surprised. She said she'd gotten a text from me the night before saying I was in trouble and needed money. My stomach turned over. I hadn't sent anything like that. I checked my accounts immediately. Someone had managed to get into my email. There were drafts of messages I hadn't written and emails forwarded to addresses I didn't recognize. They'd sent messages to my friends and family asking for help, claiming I'd been in an accident and needed cash urgently. Some of them had even responded. I called the bank and froze everything, but it wasn't fast enough. A few transactions had already gone through online shopping, money transfers. I spent hours on the phone trying to clean up the mess. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I got a text from my sister. It was strange because she rarely messaged me so late. She asked if I was okay and said she was outside. Confused, I went to the window and looked out. Her car wasn't there. I texted her back, saying I was fine and asked what she meant. She replied, "You just told me to come over. Said you needed me." I hadn't sent that. I checked my messages and found one I didn't remember typing, sent from my number to hers. My heart pounded as I stared at it. The wording didn't even sound like me. I stayed up the rest of the night, checking my locks over and over, convinced someone was watching me. I thought about calling the police, but what could they do? No one had broken in, and the texts didn't prove anything. The next morning, I went to the phone store to get my number changed. They told me my account had been accessed from another device, likely by someone who'd gotten into my carrier account using personal information from my wallet. They secured it, and I left with a new number. I hoped that would solve the problem. It didn't. By Monday, emails were coming in from places I hadn't been, confirmation of hotel reservations, online purchases, even a gym membership. Someone was pretending to be me. Worse, they were good at it. They'd use my social media to post updates, things like feeling sick, taking a break from the world, so anyone who noticed the weird messages wouldn't question them. I went to the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They opened an investigation and advised me to monitor my accounts closely. They said it could be a case of identity theft, but something about it felt too personal for that. Whoever was doing this didn't just want my money, they wanted to take over my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It said, "You can't stop me." I froze. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to block the number, but I didn't. Instead, I replied, "Who's this?" The response came instantly, "You." I didn't sleep at all after that. I called the police in the morning and showed them the texts. They said they'd trace the number and see what they could find. They told me to keep my doors locked and not to go anywhere alone. That evening, I noticed my front door lock looked different. Scratched, like someone had tried to force it. I checked all the windows, and one of them was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I stayed at a friend's house that night. The next day, I got another text. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my house. My hands were in the sink, washing dishes. I hadn't even known anyone was there. The message said, "I'm always watching." That was the last straw. I went back to the police, and this time, they sent someone to my house. They found a camera hidden in my living room, a small, black device tucked between books on a shelf. I felt sick. I hadn't noticed it, hadn't even thought to look. The officers told me to pack a bag and stay somewhere else while they investigated. I left that afternoon and went to my parents' house. For the first time, I told them everything. The police eventually traced the text to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station across town. The camera had no fingerprints, and the email trail led nowhere. Whoever it was, they'd been careful. Too careful. I haven't been back to my house since. I'm staying with my parents for now, trying to put my life back together. The texts have stopped, but I still feel like someone's watching me. I don't know if they'll ever find the person who did this, and I'm not sure I want to know who it was. It started as just another drive home from work. The kind of uneventful commute you don't even think about. I was merging onto the highway when a black SUV cut me off. I hit the brakes hard, my seatbelt digging into my chest, and I leaned on the horn without even thinking about it. I wasn't angry, really, just startled. The driver threw up a hand, like they were waving me off, and I thought that was the end of it. A couple of miles later, I noticed the SUV again. They were hanging in my blind spot, then speeding up to stay even with me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at them, but the windows were tinted too dark to see anything. I didn't think much of it until they swerved closer, like they were trying to nudge into my lane. I moved over into the right lane just to get away from them, but they followed, sticking right behind me this time. At that point, I started to feel uneasy. I checked the time, 6:30 p.m., and figured maybe they were just in a hurry to get somewhere, but my stomach was tight. I decided to ignore them and keep driving. If they were trying to mess with me, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But then they started following me off the highway. My exit wasn't busy, just a small turnoff that led into a residential area. I didn't think it was strange until I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them right there, just a car length behind me. There were no other cars around, no reason for them to be on my tail like that. I made a left at the light, and so did they. I made a right at the next street, and they stayed with me. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But then I took another left, this time into a random neighborhood I didn't even know, and they followed. I drove in circles for a while, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But no matter how many turns I made, they were there, close enough for me to see their headlights in my mirror. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, so did they. I decided to test it. At the next intersection, I pulled into a gas station and parked right in front of the convenience store, where it was bright and busy. The SUV passed by without stopping, and I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But then, not even 2 minutes later, they circled back and pulled into the lot, parking just a few spaces away. I couldn't see who was inside. The windows were still too dark. I stared at the car, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my lap, and I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know what to say. "Hey, I think someone's following me," sounded ridiculous. Instead, I got out and went into the store, my keys clutched tight in my hand. I lingered by the counter, pretending to browse the candy display while I kept an eye on the door. The SUV stayed parked outside. Nobody got out. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I took a long route back to my car, walking through the rows of pumps to avoid getting too close to the SUV. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I decided to head toward the main road, where it was busier. If they followed me again, at least there'd be witnesses. Sure enough, as soon as I pulled out, the SUV did too. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I merged into traffic, trying to act like I didn't notice them. That's when they started speeding up. I was doing 40 in a 35, and they were getting closer, their headlights bright in my rearview mirror. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but they matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. I switched lanes, hoping they'd pass, but instead, they swerved into the same lane and honked. It felt like my chest was caving in. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I'd done to make them so angry. Was it the horn? Was it because I cut them off earlier? I couldn't remember doing anything wrong. I spotted a police station up ahead and turned into the parking lot without thinking. The SUV slowed down but didn't follow me in. They rolled past, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a large figure, maybe a man, but I couldn't be sure. I stayed in the lot for a while, waiting for my nerves to settle. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, I didn't see the SUV anywhere. I decided to take a longer ride home, just to be safe. I stuck to busy streets and well-lit areas, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds. I thought I'd lost them. I really did. But when I turned onto my street, there they were, parked a few houses down from mine. My stomach dropped. I drove past my house, not wanting them to know where I lived. Instead, I went around the block and parked in someone else's driveway, crouching low in my seat. The SUV idled for a minute before pulling away. I waited until I couldn't see their taillights anymore, then backed out and drove straight to a friend's house. I didn't go home that night. I didn't even tell my friend what happened. I just made up some excuse about needing company and stayed on their couch, staring at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I filed a report with the police. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or a clearer description of the driver. I started noticing SUVs everywhere after that, at intersections, in parking lots, parked along my route to work. Each time, my stomach would clench, and I'd have to remind myself that it probably wasn't them. I never saw the black SUV again after that, but I still think about it every time I get in my car. Every time I glance in the mirror and see headlights too close behind me. I still wonder who they were, what they wanted, and why they stopped following me when they did. I don't know if I'll ever get those answers. When I checked into the hotel, it was already late. I'd been driving all day, and all I wanted was to take a shower and sleep. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just one of those chain places off the highway, but it looked clean enough from the outside. The woman at the front desk was polite. She handed me my key card, smiled, and told me my room was on the 3rd floor. The elevator creaked a bit on the way up, but I didn't think much of it. When I got to my room, I slid the key card in, and the little green light blinked. I pushed the door open, but it stopped short, like something was blocking it. At first, I thought maybe the door was sticking or the latch hadn't fully disengaged. I gave it another push, harder this time, and it opened enough for me to see inside. There was a man standing in the middle of the room. I froze. He didn't look surprised to see me, and that was the first thing that set me on edge. He just stood there, calm, like he'd been expecting me. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't doing anything threatening, but the way he stared, it was cold, detached. "This is my room," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked a little. He didn't respond. just stood there, watching me. I glanced down the hallway, half expecting someone to jump out and say this was some kind of prank, but it was empty. Did they give you the wrong room too? I asked, trying again, even though I already knew something wasn't right. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then, finally, he spoke. This room is occupied. I felt a chill run through me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, deliberate. Like he wasn't telling me, but warning me. I just checked in, I said, stepping back into the hallway. There must be some kind of mistake. He didn't answer. I slowly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and headed straight back to the elevator. When I got back to the front desk, the woman looked up, surprised to see me. I told her there was someone in my room. At first, she seemed confused, but then she frowned and started typing on her computer. That's not possible, she said after a moment. Room 314 hasn't been checked out to anyone. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, but she just looked back at me like she didn't believe me. I'm telling you, there's a man in there, I said. He said the room was occupied. She hesitated, then picked up the phone and called someone. I couldn't hear much of the conversation, but she kept glancing at me, her brow furrowed. When she hung up, she said she'd send someone up to check. She offered me a new room in the meantime, but I wasn't sure I even wanted to stay there anymore. A maintenance worker met me at the elevator a few minutes later. He had a key of his own and told me to stay in the hallway while he checked a room. I watched as he opened the door and stepped inside. He was in there for what felt like forever, and when he finally came back out, he looked at me, confused. There's no one in there, he said. I didn't believe him. I saw him, I insisted. He was standing right in the middle of the room. The worker just shrugged. Maybe he left before I got here. Door's clear now, though. I didn't want to go back in, but the thought of leaving without my things, my suitcase, my laptop, kept me rooted there. The worker handed me my key card and left, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. No sign of a man, no sign anyone had been there. My suitcase was still where I'd left it by the door, untouched. The bed was made, the bathroom light was off, and nothing looked out of place. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and even dragged the desk chair in front of it, just in case. I didn't feel safe, but I didn't know what else to do. I tried to convince myself that maybe the worker was right, that the man had just slipped out while I was downstairs. But then I noticed something. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes. It was subtle, but definitely there. The hotel was non-smoking, and I hadn't smelled it when I first walked in. I checked the trash can, the bathroom, even under the bed, but there was nothing. No ashtray, no butt, nothing. I tried to shake it off and focus on getting ready for bed. I took the fastest shower of my life, keeping the bathroom door locked and the curtain half open so I could see out. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on, even though I knew it wouldn't really make a difference. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump, the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of the building settling, even my own breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a soft noise. It took me a second to realize what it was. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle was moving. My heart felt like it stopped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the chair scraped against the floor. Then I heard the lock click, and the door creaked open an inch before catching on the chain. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it. They just stood there, silent. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When the woman answered, I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room. She said she'd send security up immediately. I didn't move until I heard footsteps in the hallway and a man's voice calling out, asking if everything was okay. When I opened the door, there were 2 security guards standing there. I told them what happened, and they checked the hallway, but it was empty. The only thing they found was the chair, still sitting in the middle of the room. I checked out first thing in the morning. The woman at the desk apologized and said she didn't know how it could have happened. She offered me a refund, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I still don't know who that man was or how he got into the room. The door had been locked, and the only key card should have been mine in the hotel's. But I know what I saw, and I know someone tried to come back later that night.